The birthday cake's single candle cast a feeble glow across Trey Smith's face as he stared at the small chocolate cupcake. Its frosting slightly melted in the stuffy apartment. Through the window, laughter and music drifted up from the Bradley mansion across the street, where another birthday celebration was in full swing, complete with a professional DJ and what looked like half of Preston Elementary's 5th grade. "Make a wish, honey," Sarah Smith whispered, her voice betraying exhaustion despite her attempt at cheerfulness. Her waitress uniform was still on, the name tag slightly crooked, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had rushed home from her second job just to be here for this moment. Trey's fingers clutched the worn envelope in his pocket, an invitation to Brandon Bradley's party that he'd never shown his mother. "Hey poor boy, come watch me unbox my new PS5 collection," it had read in Brandon's neat handwriting. "Maybe you can learn what a real birthday looks like." The apartment door suddenly burst open. Surprised, a small group of voices called out Mrs. Henderson from next door, old Mr. Patterson from the corner store, and a few kids from the building whose parents couldn't afford after-school care. They were Trey's everyday world, the people who shared their simple lives in this aging apartment complex. Sarah's face lit up, but Trey saw her hands trembling as she reached for the small gift wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. "I saved up for something special this year," she said softly. Just then, cruel laughter erupted from outside. Brandon and his friends had gathered on their perfectly manicured lawn, phones pointed up at Trey's window. "Look at that pathetic little party," Brandon's voice carried clearly through the thin glass. "Bet that's not even a real cake." Trey's face burned with shame as he saw his mother's expression crumple for just a second before she forced a smile back on. He knew she had picked up extra night shifts at the diner for weeks, probably skipping meals to afford even this simple celebration. "I'm so sorry, I need to sit down for a moment," Sarah suddenly gasped, her face pale. She swayed, reaching for the wall but missing, and collapsed onto the worn linoleum floor. Mom, Trey screamed, dropping to his knees beside her. Mrs. Henderson rushed to call 911, while Mr. Patterson tried to help Sarah up. Through his tears, Trey could still hear the laughter outside, now accompanied by the clicks of camera phones. Tomorrow, this would be all over social media at Preston Elementary. His mother, who worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and clothed, would become another cruel joke for kids who got new phones every 6 months. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and she immediately tried to sit up. "The cake," she whispered. "You haven't blown out your candle yet, sweetie." Something broke inside Trey at that moment. Looking at his mother's exhausted face, the cheap paper decorations Mrs. Henderson had helped put up, and the single cupcake they were trying to pass off as a proper birthday cake, he made a silent vow. "I promise you, Mum," he said, his young voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face, "things won't always be like this. One day I'll give you everything you deserve. We won't have to count pennies or work until we're sick. I'll make you proud, I swear." He didn't notice the shadow of worry that crossed Sarah's face at his words, too focused on the cheers from the Bradley mansion as their party reached its peak. In that moment, on his 10th birthday, something fundamental shifted in young Trey Smith's heart, a change that would set in motion events none of them could have predicted, for better or worse. Join us on this emotional journey where every dream has a price, and every sacrifice tells a story worth sharing. Sarah Smith hadn't always been the woman who counted pennies at the grocery store checkout. 12 years ago, she was Dr. Sarah Anderson, one of Memorial Hospital's most promising emergency room nurses, known for her steady hands and compassionate heart. Her colleagues used to joke that she could calm even the most distressed patient with just a gentle smile and a few kind words. That was before she met James Smith, a young teacher with dreams of opening his own school for underprivileged children. Their romance was a whirlwind coffee dates between her night shifts, long walks in the park where they planned their future, and quiet evenings grading papers together. When they married after just 6 months, no one was surprised. They were the kind of couple that made others believe in true love. Sarah kept her job at the hospital while James started saving for his dream school, teaching at Preston Elementary by day and tutoring struggling students for free in the evenings. They lived modestly in the same apartment where Sarah now raised Trey alone, but back then it felt like a palace because they had each other. When Sarah became pregnant with Trey, they transformed the small second bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls themselves with scenes from children's books. James would read to Sarah's growing belly every night, convinced their child would inherit their shared love of learning. They were poor in money but rich in dreams. Then came the night that shattered everything. James was driving home late from a parent-teacher conference when a drunk driver ran a red light. Sarah was working the ER when they brought him in. She didn't recognize him at first. The quiet, broken body on the gurney seemed impossible to reconcile with her vibrant husband. By morning she was a widow, and their unborn child would never know his father. The hospital offered her extended leave, but Sarah returned to work just 2 weeks after the funeral. She couldn't bear sitting alone in their apartment, surrounded by half-finished nursery murals and James's lesson plans. Work became her refuge, a place where she could focus on healing others while her own heart remained shattered. But fate wasn't done with Sarah Smith. Budget cuts hit the hospital hard 6 months after Trey was born. As one of the newer nurses, despite her excellent record, Sarah was among the first to be let go. Her savings dwindled quickly, even with unemployment benefits. The medical bills from Trey's birth, combined with James's funeral costs, forced her to start selling their possessions one by one. She took any job she could find, waitressing at Chuck's Diner during the day, stocking shelves at Patterson's Market in the evenings, and cleaning offices late at night. Her nursing degree hung on the wall like a reminder of a different life, gathering dust while she learned to balance 3 jobs and single motherhood. The other mothers at Trey's daycare whispered behind her back, questioning how she could leave her child for so many hours, but Sarah persevered, determined that her son would have every opportunity she could provide. She learned to function on 4 hours of sleep, to hide her exhaustion behind carefully applied drugstore makeup, to stretch $1 until it screamed. Her mother, Eleanor, helped when she could, watching Trey and slipping Sarah extra money despite her own modest pension. "James would be so proud of you," Eleanor would say, but Sarah sometimes wondered if that was true. Would he be proud of how far they'd fallen from their dreams of making a difference in the world? The final blow came when Eleanor died in a car accident, rushing to help when Trey had a high fever and Sarah was stuck at work. The guilt ate at Sarah daily, but she couldn't even afford proper grief counseling. Instead, she poured herself into working even harder, determined that her son would never feel the sting of poverty more than he already did. Now, at 34, Sarah's hands that once saved lives were rough from dishwater and cleaning chemicals. Her nurse's watch had been pawned long ago, replaced by a cheap digital one that beeped to remind her when to switch jobs. She still wore her wedding ring, not out of sentimentality. She couldn't afford to keep it much longer, but because removing it felt like giving up the last piece of the woman she used to be. Yet every night, no matter how exhausted she was, Sarah would sit with Trey during dinner, asking about his day and helping with homework. She maintained a careful facade of optimism, never letting him see her cry over bills or the growing stack of past due notices. In those quiet moments, sharing simple meals of spaghetti or mac and cheese, she could almost believe they would be okay. Her greatest fear wasn't the poverty or the exhaustion, it was that Trey would grow up believing he was worth less because they had less. Every time she saw him staring at the Bradley mansion across the street, something in her heart broke a little more. But Sarah Smith kept going, because that's what mothers do. She had long since stopped dreaming for herself, but she never stopped dreaming for her son. At Preston Elementary, the social hierarchy was as clear as the line between the cafeteria's regular tables and the premium lunch section where children with gourmet meals sat. Trey Smith, in his second-hand uniforms and scuffed shoes from the thrift store, belonged firmly in the former category. Every morning began the same way. Trey would arrive early, not because of enthusiasm for education, but because his mother's morning shift at Chuck's Diner started at 6 a.m. Mr. Patterson, the kindly store owner, would let him wait inside his corner shop, sometimes slipping him a slightly bruised apple or day-old muffin for breakfast. By 7:30, he would join the stream of students flowing into Preston's imposing brick building. The contrast between Trey and his classmates was stark. While others pulled out gleaming laptops and tablets for note-taking, Trey's backpack contained carefully preserved notebooks from the dollar store, each page precious because there wouldn't be money for new ones until next month. His pencils were stubby and well-used, often held together with tape, but they still wrote just fine. Brandon Bradley, whose father owned half the shopping centers in town, took particular delight in highlighting these differences. "Hey Smith," he would call out during computer class, "is your laptop still loading? Oh wait, you can't afford one?" The laughter that followed was always loud, always cruel, and always accompanied by the clicks of expensive phones capturing his humiliation. The teachers weren't much help. Most tried to be kind, but their sympathy often felt worse than the bullying. Mrs. Reynolds, his English teacher, once tried to give him a new notebook discreetly in front of the whole class. The whispers and snickers lasted for weeks. Even the school counselor's attempts to include him in activities backfired when it became obvious his mother couldn't afford the fees. Lunch period was the worst. Trey would sit alone at the far end of the cafeteria, carefully unpacking his sandwich always cut into two halves, because his mother believed presentation mattered even when the contents were just peanut butter and jelly. From his solitary spot, he could see Brandon's table, overflowing with friends and expensive lunchboxes filled with sushi and organic snacks. But Trey wasn't entirely alone. There was Amy Chen, whose parents ran the struggling Chinese restaurant downtown, and Marcus Washington, another scholarship student who understood what it meant to wear hand-me-downs. They formed a quiet alliance, sharing corners of the playground where the expensive phones and designer clothes didn't venture. During classes, Trey excelled despite his circumstances. He inherited his father's love of learning and his mother's determination. His essays were always thoughtful, his math problems solved with precision. Teachers praised his work, but those gold stars felt hollow when he couldn't participate in field trips or after-school clubs where his classmates forged stronger bonds. The library became his sanctuary during free periods. Between the shelves of books, social status didn't matter. He could lose himself in stories of adventure and triumph, imagining worlds where courage and character mattered more than the brand of shoes you wore. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Martinez, would sometimes let him stay past closing, understanding that home wasn't always the easiest place to study. Yet even his academic success became a target. Teacher's pet can't afford a tutor, so he has to try extra hard. The whispers would follow him. His perfect scores on tests were met with accusations of cheating. After all, how could someone who couldn't afford the study guides do better than those who had private tutors? The walk home was often the hardest part. While other students climbed into luxury SUVs or their nannies' cars, Trey would begin the 20-minute journey on foot. Sometimes he'd take the long way past the park where he vaguely remembered playing with his father. Those memories were fading, replaced by the sharp reality of watching his mother work herself to exhaustion. On rainy days, the divide felt even wider. He would arrive home soaked, watching through dripping bangs as his classmates stayed dry in their chauffeur-driven cars. His mother had saved for months to buy him a rain jacket, but he outgrew it faster than she could afford a replacement. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Trey that his father had died trying to help kids, just like him, students who needed extra support but couldn't afford it. Now he was one of those students, watching his own mother sacrifice everything just to keep him in a school where he was reminded daily that he didn't belong. By the time the final bell rang each day, Trey had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill born of necessity in a world where standing out meant becoming a target. He learned to fade into backgrounds, to smile politely at insults, to pretend he didn't care about the latest gadgets or trending topics that dominated his peers' conversations. But behind his careful mask of indifference, a dream was taking shape, a dream of change so complete that one day he would never have to be invisible again. Eleanor Anderson was more than just Sarah's mother. She was the anchor that kept their small family from drifting completely into despair after James's death. A retired schoolteacher with silver hair always neatly pinned back, she lived in a modest apartment across town, but spent most of her time with Sarah and Trey. She arrived every morning at 5:30 a.m., letting herself in with a spare key just as Sarah was preparing to leave for her first shift. The smell of coffee would already be filling the small kitchen, and Eleanor would wordlessly hand her daughter a travel mug while taking over Trey's morning routine. This quiet exchange, repeated hundreds of times, spoke volumes about their shared understanding of sacrifice. Eleanor had a way of making their poverty feel less crushing. She turned mending clothes into storytelling sessions, teaching Trey to sew buttons while sharing tales of his grandfather's adventures as a merchant marine. Under her guidance, homework became an expedition through knowledge rather than a reminder of their limited resources. She kept a jar of pencils sharpened to perfect points, insisting that presentation mattered even when using second-hand supplies. The weekends belonged to what Eleanor called memory making. She would arrive with bags of flour and sugar, turning their tiny kitchen into a classroom where Trey learned his grandmother's secret recipes. "Your father proposed to your mother over my apple pie," she would say, showing him how to crimp the edges just right. These moments were precious, not just for the skills learned, but for the stories shared about James, stories that kept his memory alive for a son who never knew him. On Trey's 9th birthday, Eleanor gave him a leather-bound journal that had belonged to his father. He wrote about the school he wanted to build, she explained, about giving every child a chance to learn, regardless of what they could afford. The journal became Trey's most treasured possession, though some pages were stained with tears, both James's original ones and those added by his son. But Eleanor's greatest gift was her presence during Sarah's absences. She never made Trey feel abandoned when his mother worked late shifts. Instead, she created magical evenings filled with shadow puppet shows on the walls, using old sheets and flashlights to bring stories to life. She taught him to find beauty in simplicity, to see wealth in knowledge rather than possessions. When bill collectors called, Eleanor would turn up the radio, teaching Trey to waltz around their small living room. "Life will always have music," she would say, "if you know how to listen for it." She supplemented their meals quietly, always arriving with leftover casseroles that seemed suspiciously fresh, never mentioning that she was living on Social Security to help them make ends meet. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening. Trey had developed a high fever, and Sarah was stuck at the diner, unable to leave without losing her job. Eleanor, despite the brewing storm, didn't hesitate to drive across town. She never made it. The roads were slick, and a truck driver didn't see her car until it was too late. The police said she died instantly, but that provided little comfort. Sarah blamed herself for not being there, for relying so heavily on her mother. Trey blamed himself for being sick, for needing help in the first place. The guilt became another resident in their small apartment, as tangible as Eleanor's absence. Eleanor's funeral was small but dignified, paid for with her modest life insurance. She was buried next to Trey's grandfather, with her favorite roses and a teacher's bell placed on her headstone. The few savings she had left were barely enough to cover 1 month's rent for Sarah and Trey, though they later learned she had been selling her jewelry piece by piece to help them. Her apartment was a treasure trove of memories. Boxes of Trey's baby clothes, carefully preserved, photo albums documenting every small triumph and celebration, stacks of greeting cards she had bought in advance for future birthdays and holidays, each already signed with her flowing script, "With all my love, Grandma Eleanor." The most poignant discovery was her diary, where she had written about her fears for Sarah and Trey, her prayers for their future, and her determination to help them survive their circumstances. The final entry, written the day she died, read: "Love isn't measured in dollars, but in the sacrifices we make for those who hold our hearts." Eleanor's wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin with decades of love, became Sarah's most precious possession, the last tangible link to both her mother and her own marriage. When circumstances later forced her to pawn it, each step to the shop felt like a betrayal of Eleanor's memory. Yet Eleanor's true legacy lived on in the lessons she taught them: that dignity doesn't depend on wealth, that love finds a way through the darkest times, and that family means never facing struggles alone. These teachings would become crucial lifelines in the challenges that lay ahead, though neither Sarah nor Trey could have imagined just how much they would need to remember them. The Bradley mansion stood like a gleaming monument to success across the street from Sarah and Trey's apartment building. 3 stories of architectural perfection, with manicured lawns and a circular driveway where luxury cars performed their daily ballet of arrivals and departures. To Trey, watching from his bedroom window, it seemed less like a house and more like a constant reminder of everything his family wasn't. Richard Bradley had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming old neighborhoods into upscale shopping centers and luxury condominiums. His wife, Victoria, chaired multiple charity boards, including Preston Elementary's fundraising committee. Their son Brandon was Trey's classmate, though classmate was a generous term for someone who barely acknowledged Trey's existence except to mock him. The contrast between the two families played out daily in painful detail. While Sarah rushed between jobs in her increasingly faded uniforms, Victoria Bradley hosted charity galas in designer gowns. When Trey brought sandwiches to school in reused plastic bags, Brandon unpacked gourmet lunches prepared by their private chef. The Bradleys' 3-car garage housed vehicles worth more than Sarah would earn in a decade. Every morning, the Bradleys' housekeeper would meticulously sweep their already spotless driveway, while Sarah hurried past, trying to catch her bus to work. Victoria would sometimes wave with practiced politeness, the kind reserved for people she considered part of the landscape rather than neighbors. Her perfect manicure and tennis bracelet would catch the morning light, a sharp contrast to Sarah's work-roughened hands. Brandon's birthday parties were legendary in the neighborhood. Professional entertainment, catered meals and gift bags worth more than Trey's entire wardrobe. The noise and laughter would drift across the street, seeping through the thin walls of the Smiths' apartment like a taunt. One year, Victoria even hired a small circus, complete with acrobats and a temporary big top on their back lawn. The Bradleys' wealth wasn't just in their possessions, it was in the casual way they wielded influence. When Brandon struggled in math, they didn't just hire a tutor, they donated a new computer lab to Preston Elementary and ensured their son received extra attention from teachers. While Sarah fought for every parent-teacher conference around her work schedule, Victoria could reorganize entire school events to fit her social calendar. Their household staff rotated through the mansion like a well-choreographed dance gardeners on Mondays, pool maintenance on Tuesdays, interior cleaners daily, and the chef preparing meals that filled the neighborhood with enticing aromas. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled to keep their small apartment clean between shifts, and the closest they got to a pool was the public one that Brandon once mockingly suggested they should stick to. Richard Bradley's presence in the neighborhood was less visible but more impactful. His company had already bought several buildings on the block, and rumors circulated about plans to revitalize the area, a euphemism that sent shivers through the remaining low-income residents. Sarah's apartment building was one of the few not yet sold, though offers to the landlord were becoming increasingly aggressive. The social divide was perhaps most evident in the small interactions. When the ice cream truck visited during summer, Brandon and his friends would buy everything they wanted, then throw away half-eaten treats while Trey watched from his window, knowing his mother had exactly $2 set aside for a special weekend treat. At Halloween, the Bradleys distributed full-size candy bars and toys, making their house the neighborhood highlight, while Sarah carefully rationed grocery store candy to make sure they didn't run out. Even the seasons highlighted the disparity. The Bradleys' Christmas decorations were professionally installed in November, their tree visible through huge windows, perfectly coordinated in silver and gold. Sarah and Trey would carefully unpack their small artificial tree, hanging ornaments Eleanor had collected over years, each with its own story but showing signs of wear. Victoria's charity work added another layer of complexity to their relationship. She organized food drives and clothing donations, speaking passionately about helping the less fortunate, while seemingly blind to the struggles of those literally across the street. Sarah once found her own donated clothes given to a church drive being sorted by Victoria's committee, who deemed them too worn for their recipients. Yet there were moments when the facade cracked. Sharp arguments sometimes echoed from the mansion late at night. Brandon would occasionally be spotted sitting alone on their grand porch, looking as lost as any other child. Victoria's perfect smile sometimes slipped when she thought no one was watching, revealing a weariness that felt surprisingly familiar to Sarah. But these glimpses of humanity did little to bridge the gulf between their worlds. The Bradleys remained on their pedestal, orchestrating their perfect life, while the Smiths continued their daily struggle to maintain dignity in the shadow of such conspicuous wealth. It was a contrast that shaped both families in ways neither fully understood, a dynamic that would eventually crack open to reveal truths that would shake both households to their foundations. The day Sarah's world began to crumble started like any other at Memorial Hospital, where she had finally secured a part-time position as a medical records clerk. It wasn't nursing, but at least she was back in healthcare, earning slightly better wages than her service jobs. The familiar antiseptic smell and bustling corridors felt like coming home, even if she now worked in the basement instead of the ER. That morning she had arrived early as usual, checking Trey's homework one last time before Mrs. Henderson took him to school. Her desk, tucked between towering shelves of medical files, was organized with the precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. A small frame held Trey's school photo, his smile slightly forced in his thrift store dress shirt, but his eyes bright with his father's determination. The first hint of trouble came when she noticed senior staff hurrying into emergency meetings. Whispers of budget cuts and corporate takeover filtered through the building. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on her files, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. She had seen this before 12 years ago in the ER, the same nervous energy, the same closed-door meetings. During her lunch break, eaten quickly at her desk to save money, her supervisor Lisa appeared with an HR representative. "Sarah, could you join us in conference room B?" The walk felt like a march to execution. Conference room B was where they had laid her off as a nurse. Now history was repeating itself with cruel precision. Memorial Hospital has been acquired by Bradley Healthcare Systems, the HR representative began, his voice professionally detached. Sarah's heart stopped at the name. Bradley, the same family that lived across from her apartment. The same people whose wealth had been a constant reminder of her struggles. The terms were clear and brutal. The new management was digitizing all records. Her position would be eliminated in 2 weeks. They offered a severance package, 2 weeks' pay, and a letter of recommendation. The HR representative slid papers across the table with practiced efficiency, explaining the terms as if discussing the weather. Sarah's hands trembled as she signed the documents. Her mind raced through calculations: rent due in 10 days, Trey's school fees next week, the electricity bill she'd been juggling. The severance wouldn't cover half of it. She thought of the diner and the market, but she was already working maximum hours there. There may be opportunities at other Bradley healthcare facilities, the HR rep offered, not looking up from his papers. Though they primarily use automated systems, now the words felt like salt in an open wound. Even her backup career was being erased by the same family that symbolized everything she couldn't provide for her son. Walking back to her desk, Sarah passed the emergency room entrance. Through the sliding doors, she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass, still wearing scrubs, but now they felt like a costume. 12 years ago, she had been Dr. Anderson's favorite nurse, known for finding veins other nurses missed. Now she was just another casualty of progress, another folder in someone's HR cabinet. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah mechanically sorted files, knowing each one brought her closer to unemployment. Her co-workers avoided eye contact, their own jobs secure for now, but fear making them distant. By 5 o'clock, her desk was cleared, years of medical knowledge reduced to a small box of personal items. Outside, the autumn air bit through her thin jacket. The bus was late, giving her unwanted time to think. She calculated and recalculated, trying to find money that didn't exist. The diner might give her more shifts, but that would mean leaving Trey alone more often. The market was already cutting hours due to Bradley's new superstore opening nearby. On the bus ride home, she passed Bradley Healthcare's gleaming corporate headquarters, its windows reflecting the setting sun like bars of gold. Somewhere in that building, someone had decided her job was redundant with a single keystroke. Someone who probably spent more on coffee each morning than she made in a day. The final blow came when she checked her phone. A message from Preston Elementary reminded her of the upcoming field trip fees, $50 she had promised Trey she would somehow manage. It was the first time he'd been invited to join his classmates for an activity, and now she couldn't even give him that. Climbing the stairs to her apartment, Sarah could see the Bradley mansion lit up for another evening soiree. Music and laughter drifted across the street, a stark counterpoint to the silence waiting in her home. She thought of Eleanor, of what her mother would say in this moment. But Eleanor was gone, and with her the last safety net their family had. Sarah let herself into the dark apartment, not bothering with lights to save on electricity. In the quiet, she finally allowed herself to cry, but only for a moment. She had exactly 20 minutes before Trey would be home, and he couldn't see her like this. He couldn't know that their precarious balance had finally tipped toward disaster. The reliable pawn shop sat between a discount liquor store and a payday loan office, its windows clouded with years of city grime. Sarah had passed it hundreds of times but never imagined she'd step inside. Now, on a grey Tuesday morning, she stood before its security gate, her mother's wedding ring burning a hole in her pocket. Inside, the air was thick with desperation and dust. Glass cases displayed jewelry that once marked celebrations and milestones, now reduced to their weight in precious metals. Behind the counter, Mr. Goldman, a man whose kind eyes betrayed his gruff exterior, watched Sarah approach. He had seen that look before, the slightly lifted chin, the forced composure of someone trying to maintain dignity while selling pieces of their heart. "It was my mother's," Sarah said quietly, placing the ring on the counter. Her hand shook as she unwrapped it from the handkerchief Eleanor had embroidered years ago. The gold band was thin from decades of wear, but the small diamond still caught the fluorescent light, throwing tiny rainbows onto the scratched glass counter. Mr. Goldman examined the ring with professional detachment, though his expression softened when he noticed the inscription inside "Love endures, Henry Eleanor, 1962. He reached for his loop, more out of courtesy than necessity. They both knew Sarah wasn't here to negotiate. She was here because rent was due, and Trey needed new shoes for school. "I'll give you $400, he said finally, his voice gentle. The setting's a bit worn, but the stone's good quality. They both knew it was worth more. But pawning always meant accepting less than value. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. 400 would cover rent, barely, but not the utilities or Trey's shoes. As Mr. Goldman prepared the paperwork, Sarah remembered the day Eleanor had given her the ring. It was just after James's funeral, when Sarah was still numb with grief and heavy with unborn Trey. Your father gave me this ring when we had nothing," Eleanor had said. "It reminded me daily that love is worth more than gold. Now it's yours to remember the same." The forms felt heavy in her hands. 30 days to reclaim the ring at a 20% interest rate. Sarah's signature was shaky as she signed, each stroke of the pen feeling like a betrayal. Mr. Goldman counted out the bills carefully, adding an extra 20 with a quick wink. "For good luck," he said, though they both knew it was pity. Walking out, Sarah caught her reflection in the shop window. She touched the empty space on her left hand where James's ring used to sit pawned 2 years ago for Trey's emergency room visit. Now Eleanor's ring would join it behind the bulletproof glass, another piece of family history sacrificed to survival. Outside, a young couple walked past, the girl admiring a new engagement ring that sparkled in the morning sun. Sarah quickly turned away, her eyes burning. She remembered James proposing with a ring he'd saved 6 months to buy, how they'd laughed about eating ramen noodles until the payments were done. That ring was long gone too, sold to cover James's funeral expenses. The bus ride home was a blur of calculations. $400 for rent, leaving nothing for bills. The diner owed her next week's pay, but that was already promised to Preston Elementary for Trey's overdue lunch account. She had picked up extra cleaning shifts, but that money was earmarked for winter clothes Trey had outgrown. Passing the Bradley mansion, Sarah noticed Victoria Bradley stepping into her chauffeured car, diamonds glinting at her throat and wrists. Victoria had once commented at a school function about how some people didn't understand the importance of maintaining appearances. Sarah wondered what Victoria would think of maintaining appearances while pawning your mother's wedding ring. At home, Sarah placed the pawn ticket in Eleanor's old recipe box, alongside other papers that marked their declined medical bills, past due notices, the letter terminating her nursing position. The box had once held family recipes, precious instructions for meals that brought them together. Now it held proof of how far they had fallen. That evening, as she prepared Trey's dinner spaghetti again, the cheapest meal she could make stretch, Sarah caught herself rubbing her empty ring finger. The phantom weight of Eleanor's ring seemed heavier now that it was gone. She thought of her mother's words about love being worth more than gold, wondering if Eleanor had ever imagined her cherished ring would end up in a pawn shop display case. When Trey asked about her bare hand at dinner, Sarah forced a smile. "Just getting it cleaned, honey," she lied, the words tasting bitter. She promised herself she would get it back somehow, add extra shifts, skip more meals, whatever it took. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning of what they would have to sacrifice to stay afloat. The eviction notice arrived on a Thursday, slipped under their door like a death sentence printed on legal paper. Sarah found it when she returned from her night shift, her feet aching and uniform stained with coffee from a customer's careless gesture. The landlord's message was clear: 30 days to vacate. No exceptions, no extensions. Her hands trembled as she read the details. The building had been sold to Bradley Development Corporation, another piece of their lives being swept away by the family across the street. Plans for luxury condominiums were already approved by the city council. The generous relocation allowance offered wouldn't cover even first month's rent at the cheapest apartments in a safe neighborhood. Sarah sank onto their worn couch, the springs creaking in familiar protest. Through the window, she could see construction equipment already gathering around the block, like vultures circling their prey. Other buildings had already been emptied, their former residents scattered to wherever people go when they can't afford to stay in their own neighborhood. The room started spinning, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. The combination of exhaustion, malnutrition from skipped meals, and this final blow proved too much. Sarah tried to stand, to reach for the phone, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Eleanor's photo on the wall, her mother's smile suddenly seeming more worried than warm. Mrs. Henderson found her an hour later, coming to drop off some leftover bread from the bakery where her daughter worked. The thud from the apartment had caught her attention. Sarah was unconscious on the floor, the eviction notice still clutched in her hand, her breathing shallow and pulse racing. The ambulance arrived quickly, but Sarah regained consciousness only to refuse transport. "I can't afford it," she whispered to Mrs. Henderson, her voice cracking. "The insurance. We don't have—" She didn't need to finish. They all knew an ambulance ride could mean the difference between eating next month or not. Trey arrived home from school to find his mother on the couch, Mrs. Henderson force-feeding her soup, while making phone calls to local shelters and affordable housing organizations. The look on his face, fear mixed with a child's desperate attempt to be brave, would haunt Sarah for months to come. "It's just a little dizzy spell," Sarah insisted, trying to sit up straighter. But her body betrayed her, trembling visibly. The room kept tilting sideways, and the headache pounding behind her eyes made even the dim afternoon light unbearable. Years of working multiple jobs, of sacrificing sleep and proper meals, had finally caught up with her. Mrs. Henderson's daughter brought over a blood pressure monitor from the pharmacy where she worked. The readings were alarming, dangerously high numbers that demanded immediate medical attention. But Sarah's protestations about costs won out. They compromised with over-the-counter medication and strict orders to rest. That evening, as Trey did his homework at the kitchen table, Sarah could hear him sniffling quietly. He was trying to hide his tears, just as she had hidden so many of her own. The eviction notice lay between them like a physical barrier, its legal jargon mocking their powerlessness. Through their thin walls came the sound of the Bradleys' latest party. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter floated across the street, and music from a live band drifted through their windows. Somewhere in that mansion, decisions were being made that would uproot dozens of families, all in the name of progress and profit. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the diner manager. Her shift tomorrow couldn't be covered. No work meant no pay. No pay meant no chance of finding a new apartment. The room started spinning again, and she pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself to stay conscious. Trey's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Mommy asked," his voice small but determined. "Are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the air, heavy with all the things she couldn't promise him anymore. Security, stability, a home. Sarah opened her mouth to answer, to offer some maternal reassurance, but no words came. Instead, the room tilted sharply and darkness crept in again. She was vaguely aware of Trey's panicked voice calling her name, of Mrs. Henderson rushing in from next door, of someone mentioning 911 despite her previous refusal. As consciousness slipped away, Sarah's last coherent thought was of Eleanor. Her mother had always said God never gives you more than you can handle. But lying there, unable to even reassure her own son, Sarah wondered if perhaps this time the weight was finally too much to bear. The eviction notice fluttered to the floor, its harsh words blurring as Sarah's world faded to black. Across the street, the Bradley mansion's lights continued to sparkle, oblivious to the lives crumbling in its shadow. The fluorescent lights of Patterson's Market buzzed overhead as Trey stood in line, clutching his mother's last $5 bill. Mr. Patterson had called earlier. Sarah's check from the diner had bounced, but he'd still let them buy essentials until she could make it good. The shame of that charity burned in Trey's throat as he watched the elderly shopkeeper ring up their meager purchases: a loaf of day-old bread, a can of soup, and store-brand spaghetti. "One more thing," Trey said quietly, sliding $2 across the counter. "A lottery ticket, please." Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. He'd never sold a ticket to Trey before. But the boy's eyes held a desperation that stopped any questions. He printed the ticket, random numbers flickering onto the thin paper that represented such impossible hopes. That evening, Sarah lay on their couch, still weak from her collapse, while Trey watched the lottery drawing on their ancient television. The reception was poor, but the numbers came through clearly enough: 32, 56, 19, 16, 36, and lucky number 21. Trey checked his ticket once, twice, 3 times, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. Mommy's voice cracked. "Mom, I think we won." Sarah struggled to sit up, her vision still blurry. "What do you mean, honey?" "And the numbers, they match. All of them match." The next hours passed in a blur. Mr. Patterson verified the ticket after hours, his hands trembling as much as Trey's. Calls were made, forms were signed. The local news caught wind of the story 10-year-old boy saves family with lottery win. Photographers appeared outside their apartment, capturing the contrast between their humble home and the Bradley mansion looming in the background. The prize, after taxes, came to just over $1 million. To Trey, it might as well have been all the money in the world. To Sarah, it represented something far more complicated, hope tinged with terror. She'd seen what sudden wealth could do to people, how it could change them in ways that money could never fix. But Trey had already made up his mind. The morning after the win, he stood in their small kitchen, his father's old briefcase in hand, a thrift store purchase he'd saved 3 months of allowance to buy. "I'm moving out," he announced, his voice straining to sound older than his 10 years. "I can take care of myself now. You don't have to worry about me anymore." Sarah felt her heart fracture. "Trey, honey, that's not how this works. You're still a child, my child." "I'm a millionaire," he corrected her, chin lifted in a way that painfully reminded her of James. "I can hire people to take care of me." Better people than he stopped, but the unspoken words hung between them like poison. The lottery officials had been clear due to Sarah's recent medical issues and their precarious financial situation. The court would appoint a financial guardian for Trey's winnings. The money would be his, but managed professionally until he turned 18. Yet somehow, in the space of one night, her sweet boy who helped elderly neighbors with groceries had transformed into someone she barely recognized. "You've always said money is tight," Trey continued, his voice harder than any child's should be. "Well, now it's not. Not for me anyway. I'm going to live somewhere better. Somewhere," like he gestured toward the Bradley mansion. Sarah watched helplessly as her son pulled away, emotionally if not yet physically. The money that should have been their salvation was becoming a wall between them, built of luxury catalogs and real estate brochures that had started appearing in their mailbox. Later that night, Sarah found the remnants of Trey's childhood stuffed in garbage bags, his father's journal, the hand-knit sweaters from Eleanor, photos of simpler times. He had ordered all new things, designer versions of everything he'd ever been denied. Each discarded item felt like a rejection, not just of their poverty, but of their love. The lottery ticket, now safely stored in a bank vault, had been bought with their grocery money Sarah had earned serving endless plates of eggs and coffee with a smile, no matter how her feet ached. She should have been angry about the risk Trey had taken. Instead, she felt a deeper fear that in gaining a fortune, she might lose something far more precious, her son's heart. As she lay awake that night, listening to Trey scroll through luxury hotel websites on his new phone, Sarah remembered Eleanor's words about love being worth more than gold. She wondered if any amount of money could fill the void that was growing between her and her child, or if some distances once created could never truly be bridged. The transformation began the morning after the lottery win was confirmed. Trey Smith, who had worn thrift store clothes and counted pennies for school lunch just days before, now sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Hamilton Associates, Private Wealth Management. The leather chair dwarfed his small frame, but his expression carried a gravitas beyond his 10 years. Mr. Smith, the financial advisor, began, unconsciously adopting the formal tone he used with adult clients. "Your assets will be managed in a trust until you reach 18. However, you have access to a monthly allowance and can make supervised purchasing decisions." The man paused, noting how Trey's eyes never wavered, calculating and cold in a way that made him uneasy. "I want a suite at the Grand Plaza Hotel," Trey announced, his voice steady. "And I want to hire staff, a driver, a personal chef, and someone to buy me new clothes." The advisor exchanged glances with the court-appointed guardian, both adults struggling to reconcile this composed demands with the child before them. Sarah, sitting quietly in the corner, as required by law, felt each word like a physical blow. The son who had helped her clip coupons and understood why they couldn't afford name-brand cereals was vanishing before her eyes, replaced by a miniature version of the very people who had made their lives so difficult. The first purchase was a wardrobe from exclusive boutiques, designer suits tailored to his small frame, shoes that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, watches that could have paid their utilities for a year. Trey insisted on burning his old clothes in the hotel parking lot, as if trying to incinerate every trace of his former life. Within days, he had established himself in the hotel's premium suite, the same one where visiting celebrities stayed. The staff, initially amused by their young resident, quickly learned he expected to be treated like any wealthy patron. He ordered room service for every meal, sending back dishes that didn't meet his newly acquired standards. Sarah was allowed to visit, but Trey set strict hours, like a business executive managing his calendar. He hired a personal shopper who worked exclusively with luxury brands, a nutritionist who planned organic, gourmet meals, and a tutor who could prepare him for private school applications. Each new hire was instructed to address him as Mr. Smith, never Trey. The media loved the story, the rags to riches tale of a child lottery winner. Reporters camped outside the hotel, capturing images of Trey in his bespoke suits, being chauffeured in a luxury car. Local news ran features about his inspiring transformation, though none seemed to question the disturbing nature of a 10-year-old living alone in a hotel. Most painful for Sarah were the small changes in his behavior. The way he now wrinkled his nose at the mention of spaghetti dinners, how he refused to hug her if she came straight from work, claiming her waitress uniform would wrinkle his suits. The calculated way he began referring to their old apartment as that place rather than home. One afternoon, Sarah arrived for their scheduled visit to find Trey hosting a lunch party for his new friends, all children of wealthy families who had previously ignored or mocked him. They sat around the suite's dining table, eating cuisine Sarah couldn't pronounce, while a private etiquette tutor instructed them on proper fork placement. Mother Trey said when he noticed her, using the formal title he'd recently adopted, "I wasn't expecting you until 4. We're rather busy with our social obligations." The other children giggled, and Sarah recognized Brandon Bradley among them, now treating Trey like a beloved friend. That evening, alone in their apartment, Sarah found Trey's old piggy bank in the back of his closet. Inside was a crumpled list in his childish handwriting. Things to buy when we're rich. At the top was new shoes for Mom and fix Mrs. Henderson's leaky roof. The current reality of designer suits and gourmet meals for one seemed a cruel mockery of those innocent dreams. The final blow came when Trey's lawyer delivered a message her son had decided to petition for emancipated minor status. The papers cited his financial independence and claimed his current living situation was more suitable for his social development than remaining with a single mother who worked service jobs. Sarah sat in their kitchen, holding the legal documents, remembering how just weeks ago they had sat here doing his homework together, sharing dreams about a better future. But their versions of better had diverged dramatically, hers involving family, love, and simple comforts, his apparently requiring the complete erasure of their shared past. Outside, a fleet of moving trucks arrived at the hotel, delivering custom furniture for Trey's suite. From her window, Sarah watched as her son directed the placement of each piece with the authority of a seasoned socialite. In just 2 weeks, poverty had loosened its grip on Trey Smith, but something far more precious seemed to be slipping away in its place. The Coleman Arms stood as a testament to opulence directly across from Sarah and Trey's old apartment building. Its gleaming facade, with floor-to-ceiling windows and private balconies, had always been a symbol of the life they couldn't access. Now Trey stood in the marble-floored lobby, signing a lease for the penthouse suite, while his mother watched from the street through rain-streaked glass. "Welcome home, Mr. Smith," the building manager gushed, handling the unusual situation of a child tenant with practiced diplomacy. The court-appointed guardian nodded approval as Trey selected finishing touches for his new residence: Italian marble countertops, custom wallpaper, smart home technology that could rival the Bradley mansion. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her son's new home offered a direct view into their old apartment windows. From his private terrace, Trey could look down on their former life like a monarch surveying his abandoned kingdom. The contrast was stark. His new home cost more per month than she had earned in a year. The moving-in process became a spectacle for the neighborhood. Professional decorators streamed in and out, carrying exclusive furniture pieces and artwork that cost more than Sarah's car. Trey supervised every detail with meticulous attention, rejecting anything that didn't meet his newly acquired standards of luxury. "The thread count in these sheets is insufficient," he informed the wide-eyed housekeeping staff, sounding like a miniature version of Victoria Bradley, "and I specifically requested Himalayan salt lamps for the meditation room." The staff scrambled to accommodate, treating him with the same deference they showed their adult residents. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as her son's new life took shape. Through the massive windows of his penthouse, she could see him hosting dinner parties for his new friends, all children of privilege who now treated him as one of their own. The same kids who had once mocked his free lunch status now competed for invitations to his personal chef's tasting menu. The building security staff had clear instructions Sarah was allowed to visit, but only with advance notice and during specified hours. She needed to sign in like any other guest, subjected to the same scrutiny as delivery personnel. The first time she was asked to wait for approval before seeing her own son, something inside her crumbled. Trey's bedroom faced his old one across the street. At night, Sarah could see the soft glow of his new designer lamp, where once they had used a thrift store fixture with mismatched bulbs. His old room stood empty now, the walls still bearing tape marks from posters he'd refused to take to his new home. The penthouse quickly became a symbol of everything money could buy. Professional cleaners maintained its pristine condition. Personal shoppers kept the custom-built closets stocked with the latest fashions. A private chef prepared meals in the professional-grade kitchen, while Sarah continued to make spaghetti for one in their old apartment. One evening, Sarah noticed Trey standing on his terrace, staring at their old building. For a moment he looked like her little boy again, small and uncertain in the gathering dusk. But then Brandon Bradley arrived for their scheduled playdate, and Trey's posture shifted back into his new persona, straight-backed, chin lifted, every inch the young millionaire. The distance between them grew with each passing day, measured not just in physical space but in the widening gap between their worlds. Sarah continued to work her shifts at the diner, now serving breakfast to residents of the Coleman Arms who never recognized her as the mother of their young neighbor. Some even left her condescending tips with notes about improving her situation. Trey's new home became a fortress of luxury, protected by doormen and security systems. The boy who once helped her clip coupons now had a personal accountant to manage his allowance. The child who had shared her dreams of a better life now lived that life alone, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing of what they had once shared. The final transformation of the space came when Trey hired an interior designer to remake the penthouse in his image. Gone were the few personal items he had initially brought: his father's journal, family photos, the hand-knit blanket from Eleanor. In their place stood museum-quality artwork and custom furniture that could have been featured in design magazines. From her kitchen window, Sarah watched the delivery of a grand piano Trey had never played, but apparently every luxury apartment needed one. As twilight settled over the city, she could see him moving through his new rooms, a small figure in an adult's world, orchestrating a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt increasingly hollow to the one person who knew him best. The lights in both apartments came on as darkness fell, his automated by smart home technology, hers. switched on by hand to save electricity. Two worlds, separated by a street but divided by so much more, each illuminating a different version of what success might mean. The transformation of Trey's social circle happened as suddenly as his financial windfall. Brandon Bradley, who had once led the mockery of Trey's free lunch status, now appeared at his door bearing an expensive gaming console as a housewarming gift. Behind him stood a carefully curated group of Preston Elementary's elite children whose parents' names graced hospital wings and university buildings. "Everyone's dying to hang out at your place," Trey Brandon announced, his previous contempt replaced by calculated friendliness. "Your private chef is like Instagram famous now." The other children nodded eagerly, their designer clothes and practiced smiles forming a sharp contrast to the memory of how they'd treated him mere weeks ago. Trey embraced his new role with uncomfortable enthusiasm. His daily schedule began morphing into a parody of adult luxury morning yoga with a private instructor, brunch meetings with his business associates, all aged 10 to 11, and afternoon shopping sprees at boutiques that once wouldn't have let him through the door. The new friends came with new rules. Amy Chen and Marcus Washington, who had shared their lunches with him during harder times, found themselves quietly excluded. "They just don't understand our lifestyle," Trey explained to Brandon, echoing words that had once been used against him. The irony seemed lost on him as he adjusted his custom-tailored blazer. His vocabulary shifted to mirror his wealthy peers. Words like basic and tacky peppered his conversation. He began referring to his mother as my former guardian in social situations. When Sarah brought him homemade cookies during an approved visit, he dismissed them as pedestrian. In front of his new friends, leaving the treats untouched on an imported marble counter. Social media became his new obsession. His private chef documented every meal, his personal shopper curated his wardrobe for maximum online impact, and his new friends taught him the art of the perfect selfie. Each post was carefully constructed to showcase his transformation from scholarship student to social elite. Weekend activities transformed from helping Mrs. Henderson with her groceries to hosting lavish pool parties in the Coleman Arms rooftop facility. Children who had once shunned him now competed for invitations, their parents suddenly discovering an interest in playdates with the charming lottery winner. Brandon took on the role of social gatekeeper, advising Trey on who was worth including in their circle. Remember, he counseled during one of their private brunches, "We're not just rich, we're influential. Some people simply don't belong in our world." The words echoed with familiar cruelty, but now Trey nodded in agreement. The influence of his new friends extended beyond social activities. Trey began mimicking their mannerisms, the slight lift of an eyebrow when something was deemed beneath them, the casual way they dismissed service workers, the practiced laugh that never quite reached their eyes. His childhood empathy seemed to fade with each passing day. During a particularly lavish dinner party, one of his new friends spilled sauce on an expensive rug. Without hesitation, Trey called for the cleaning staff, treating them with the same dismissive tone he had once endured from others. Sarah, arriving for a scheduled visit, witnessed this scene from the doorway, her son's transformed behavior stopping her in her tracks. His new circle introduced him to their family businesses and social obligations. Charity galas carefully selected for maximum social impact, junior golf club memberships, and private art lessons filled his calendar. Each activity seemed designed to further separate him from his former life. The children who now surrounded Trey had been raised in privilege, taught from birth to navigate the complex waters of wealth and social status. They molded him with subtle suggestions and carefully placed comments, each one pulling him further from his roots. "You can't wear last season's designers," they advised, "and charity work looks good for future college applications." Perhaps most telling was the change in his dreams. Where once he had talked about becoming a teacher like his father, helping kids who couldn't afford tutoring, now he spoke of investment portfolios and real estate development. His new friends nodded approvingly as he discussed potential business ventures, their young faces serious with inherited authority. The final symbol of his transformation came during a school assembly. When the principal announced a fundraiser for the scholarship program, the same one that had once helped Trey attend Preston Elementary, he joined his new friends in rolling their eyes. "People should learn to help themselves," he remarked, loud enough for his former classmates to hear. Sarah, working an extra shift at the diner to cover their old apartment's final bills, missed seeing this moment, but she felt its impact in every interaction with her son, each visit becoming more formal, more distant. The child who had once shared her dreams of making a difference was disappearing behind a facade of privilege crafted by those who had once made him feel worthless. The first time Trey referred to Sarah as the woman who used to take care of me, he was hosting a caviar tasting for his new social circle. The words fell from his lips with practiced casualness, but they struck Sarah, standing in the doorway for their scheduled visit, like physical blows. She watched her son delicately balance imported fish eggs on artisanal crackers, his small fingers mimicking the precise movements his wealthy friends had taught him. Their weekly dinners, once sacred family time, became carefully orchestrated performances. Trey insisted on meeting at upscale restaurants where Sarah felt painfully out of place in her work clothes. He would order in fluent French, correcting her pronunciation when she tried to read the menu, each correction widening the gulf between them. "Mother," he began saying during these dinners, the formal address replacing the warm mom of their past. "Perhaps we should discuss limiting our meetings to special occasions." His voice carried the same measured tone Victoria Bradley used when dismissing household staff. "My social calendar is becoming quite demanding." The physical distance was matched by emotional walls that grew higher with each passing day. When Sarah came to his penthouse apartment, she had to announce herself through the intercom system, often waiting while Trey's personal assistant checked if he was available. The same boy who once ran to hug her after school now greeted her with a practiced air kiss, careful not to wrinkle his bespoke suits. Their conversations became exercises in avoiding the past. Trey deflected any mention of their old apartment, their struggling neighbors, or the community that had supported them through hard times. When Sarah brought up Mrs. Henderson's failing health, Trey checked his phone, muttering about depressing topics ruining his appetite. One afternoon, Sarah arrived to find Trey and his new friends watching old news footage of their neighborhood on his massive TV screen, laughing at the quaint conditions they had once called home. "Can you believe I used to live like that?" Trey asked his audience, not noticing his mother's presence. Thank God for social mobility. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference. Trey had arranged for his financial advisor to attend in Sarah's place, claiming her limited understanding of his new circumstances made her presence unnecessary. When she showed up anyway, still in her diner uniform, he treated her like an unwelcome intrusion into his carefully curated new life. "Really, Mother," he said afterward, his voice dripping with the same condescension he had once endured, "you could at least have changed clothes." Appearances matter in our circle, the word "our" hung between them, a clear indication that she was no longer included in his definition of family. Their text messages became increasingly formal, reading like business correspondence rather than mother-son communication. "Dear Mother, please refrain from sending homemade items to my residence. The staff has been instructed to maintain specific dietary standards." Each message was signed "Regards, Trey Smith," as if they were distant acquaintances. Sarah kept trying to bridge the growing divide. She learned the names of fine wines to understand his new interests, studied etiquette guides to avoid embarrassing him, and picked up extra shifts to buy clothes that wouldn't make him cringe. But each effort seemed to push him further away, highlighting the differences between their worlds rather than connecting them. The photos in Trey's apartment told the story of his transformation, where once he had displayed family pictures, now there were only professionally shot portraits of himself in expensive settings. Their history together was literally being erased, replaced by carefully crafted images of wealth and success. During one of their increasingly rare interactions, Sarah noticed a familiar object in his trash, the journal his father had kept about his dreams of helping underprivileged students. When she retrieved it, Trey's reaction was immediate and harsh. "That belongs in the past," he said coldly. "I'm creating a new legacy now." The final indicator of their growing distance came in the form of an email from Trey's legal team. He was requesting that all future communication be handled through his representatives, citing the need for professional boundaries in their relationship. The lawyers used terms like emotional space and healthy separation, but the message was clear: her son was methodically removing her from his life. That night, alone in their old apartment, Sarah looked through Trey's baby book, tracing the journey from the infant she had cradled to the stranger who now lived across the street. Each page chronicled moments of love and connection that seemed impossible to reconcile with their current reality. As lights blazed in Trey's penthouse, where another exclusive party was beginning, Sarah wondered if wealth hadn't just divided their circumstances but had somehow stolen her son's heart entirely. The mirror in Trey's marble-clad bathroom reflected a stranger. At 11 years old, his transformation was more than physical. Designer clothes and perfectly styled hair were just the surface of a deeper metamorphosis. Gone was the boy who had helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. In his place stood a miniature tycoon, complete with pressed pocket squares and a smartphone permanently attached to his hand. Every morning began with a ritual that would have been comical if it wasn't so heartbreaking. His personal stylist, Ms. Winters, would lay out 3 outfit options, each costing more than Sarah's monthly rent. Trey would study each combination with the seriousness of a CEO preparing for a board meeting, often rejecting them all for perceived imperfections invisible to anyone else. The stitching on this Armani blazer is 3 shades darker than the pants he complained one morning, his voice carrying the practiced disdain of old money. And these loafers? They're practically screaming new wealth. Ms. Winters, who had dressed actual celebrities, found herself taking notes from a pre-teen about the subtle signals of social status. His speech patterns changed first, adopting the clipped tones and careful enunciation of his wealthy peers. Words like "actually" and "quite" peppered his conversation, each syllable measured for maximum effect. He developed a habit of slightly tilting his head when listening, a gesture borrowed directly from Richard Bradley's repertoire of condescending expressions. But late at night, when his penthouse fell quiet and his new friends had gone home, moments of uncertainty crept in. Security cameras caught him standing on his balcony, staring at his old apartment building, his carefully constructed facade cracking just enough to reveal the lost child beneath. These moments never lasted long. By morning, the mask would be firmly back in place. The transformation extended to his education. Trey hired tutors not just for academics, but for the subtle arts of wealth, wine appreciation with grape juice substitutes, art collection, and the proper way to dismiss servants without appearing cruel. Each lesson pushed him further from his roots, teaching him to view his past life as something to be overcome rather than honored. His new identity came with rules he absorbed like oxygen. Never wear the same outfit twice in a month. Always tip exactly 20%. Any more shows desperation to be liked. Any less suggests new money. Refer to private islands by their names, not their locations. Each guideline was another brick in the wall between his past and present. Food became a particular focus of his reinvention. The boy who had once savored his mother's spaghetti now sent back dishes at Michelin-starred restaurants for being pedestrian. His personal chef, trained in Paris, watched in bewilderment as this child debated the merits of different truffle varieties with the conviction of a seasoned gastronome. Social media documented his transformation in real time. Each post was carefully curated to showcase his new lifestyle while erasing any trace of his former existence. Photos were staged to capture the perfect angle of his penthouse view, his designer accessories casually but strategically placed in each frame. His following grew, attracted by the spectacle of a child living an adult's luxury fantasy. The identity crisis peaked during a charity gala at Preston Elementary. Trey arrived in a custom tuxedo, having donated enough to have the new computer lab named after him, as he stood at the podium delivering a speech about giving back. His eyes briefly met Sarah's. She was working the catering staff to make ends meet. For a moment, his carefully constructed world wavered, reality bleeding through the cracks of his new persona. His bedroom became a testament to internal conflict. Behind the carefully arranged displays of wealth, the rare books he never read, the antique globe he never touched, lay hidden reminders of his past. His father's journal, rescued from the trash by Sarah, had found its way back into his possession, tucked away in a drawer beneath silk pajamas. The most telling sign of his struggle came during mandatory counseling sessions required by the court to monitor his adjustment. The therapist notes detailed a child playing a role so completely he was losing himself in the performance. Patient exhibits signs of dissociative behavior, one report read, creating an elaborate alternate personality based on perceived expectations of wealth. His nightmares, when they came, featured him drowning in designer suits, unable to swim because the proper etiquette for drowning hadn't been covered in his lessons. He would wake gasping, reaching for a comfort his imported Egyptian cotton sheets couldn't provide. These moments of vulnerability were his most closely guarded secret. Not even his personal assistant was allowed to know about the night terrors. The transformation reached its symbolic peak when Trey legally changed his signature. Gone was the childish scrawl that had signed birthday cards to his mother. In its place appeared a practiced flourish that could have graced banknotes. He spent hours perfecting it, each loop and curve designed to suggest old money confidence rather than new money enthusiasm. But perhaps the most profound change was in his eyes. Photographs from before the lottery showed a child's open gaze, full of hope and possibility. His new official portraits captured something else, a calculated stare that evaluated everything and everyone for their potential value. The warmth that had once made him Mrs. Henderson's favorite neighbor had been replaced by a cold efficiency that would have made any corporate raider proud. As autumn turned to winter, Trey Smith completed his metamorphosis from scholarship student to social elite. Every trace of his former self had been carefully erased, marketed, or reimagined to fit his new narrative. Yet in unguarded moments, a flinch at the sound of his mother's voice in the lobby, a hesitation before dismissing a former friend, glimpses of the original Trey still surfaced, like a ghost haunting the luxury he had built around himself. The question that no one dared ask, not his therapist, not his new friends, and certainly not Sarah, was simple but devastating in becoming everything he'd once envied. Had Trey Smith lost something money could never replace? The answer played out in the growing distance between mother and son, in the carefully maintained facade of his new life, and in the silent tears that sometimes fell on imported silk pillowcases late at night, when no one was watching the boy who had everything except himself. In the flickering light of her apartment, Sarah Smith developed a new routine, watching her son's life unfold through windows that felt like movie screens. Each morning, she would stand at her kitchen sink, pretending to wash dishes while observing Trey's elaborate breakfast ritual in his penthouse across the street. His personal chef would prepare meals that cost more than her weekly grocery budget, while she sipped instant coffee and tried to remember how his laughter used to sound. The diner where she worked offered a perfect view of the Coleman Arms entrance. She learned to time her breaks with Trey's departures, watching from behind the coffee counter as he emerged in his tailored suits, surrounded by an entourage of staff. Sometimes he would stop at the diner with his new friends, never acknowledging her presence beyond a cursory nod, as if she were any other waitress serving his organic green smoothie. The physical toll of her grief manifested in subtle ways. Her uniforms hung looser, meals forgotten in the constant worry about her son. Dark circles beneath her eyes deepened, poorly concealed by drugstore makeup. Her hands, once steady enough for nursing, developed a slight tremor that made carrying coffee pots increasingly difficult. Yet she persisted in her devotion. Every Sunday she still cooked his favorite meal, spaghetti, with extra meatballs, mac and cheese with the crispy top he loved even though he never came to eat them. The leftovers would feed her for days, each bite a bittersweet reminder of family dinners that now seemed like scenes from another life. The other workers at Chuck's diner noticed the change in her. Regular customers who had once enjoyed her warm smile and easy conversation now encountered a quieter Sarah, one who moved through her shifts like a ghost. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant next door would sometimes leave containers of soup on her doorstep, understanding without words the unique pain of watching your child slip away. Sarah kept every newspaper clipping about Trey, creating a scrapbook of his new life that she could only observe from afar. She learned about his activities through local society pages, charity galas, private club memberships, exclusive parties. Each photo showed him looking less like her little boy and more like a stranger wearing expensive masks. The hardest moments came during parent-teacher conferences, where she now sat alone while Trey's financial advisors handled his academic affairs. Teachers who had once praised her dedication now avoided eye contact, uncertain how to address the mother of the school's most famous student, who no longer acknowledged her existence. In her apartment, Sarah maintained Trey's room exactly as he had left it, despite knowing he would never return to sleep there. She would sometimes sit on his bed late at night, holding his old teddy bear and reading from the books they used to share. The space became a shrine to the child she had lost, not to death, but to a different kind of absence. Her own medical needs went unaddressed as she redirected her dwindling resources to maintaining appearances. The chronic pain in her back from years of waitressing intensified, but doctor visits seemed an unnecessary luxury when every spare dollar went toward clothes that might not embarrass Trey if they happened to cross paths. The wedding ring she had pawned to pay their rent remained unredeemed, but Sarah continued to visit it weekly at Mr. Goldman's shop. She would stand before the display case, remembering Eleanor's words about love being worth more than gold, wondering if her mother had ever imagined wealth could build walls higher than poverty ever did. During her rare approved visits to Trey's penthouse, Sarah maintained a careful facade of her own. She learned to swallow her tears when he corrected her table manners, to smile politely when his friends made thinly veiled comments about her occupation, to pretend each rejection didn't pierce her heart anew. The neighborhood watched her suffering with mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, tried to offer comfort through small kindnesses, fresh bread, spare vegetables, and ear to listen. Others, particularly those who had always looked down on their modest lifestyle, seemed to take satisfaction in her public humiliation, as if her pain validated their own prejudices. Each night, Sarah would write letters to Trey that she never sent. She filled pages with memories of his first steps, his early words, the way he used to curl against her during thunderstorms. These letters became her diary of loss, documenting the slow erosion of their relationship against the backdrop of his rising social status. Her faith never wavered, though her prayers changed. Where once she had asked for financial security, she now prayed simply for her son to find his way back to himself. She kept his father's photo by her bed, sometimes asking James in whispered conversations how to reach their child through the fortress of wealth he had built around himself. The city's changing seasons marked time's passage with cruel efficiency. Fall brought college preparation meetings she wasn't invited to attend. Winter saw holiday parties she could only glimpse through windows. Spring heralded charity events where she served appetizers to guests cooing over her son's generosity, never knowing the server in the corner was his mother. Yet through it all, Sarah maintained her dignity with a quiet grace that even her son's new wealthy friends couldn't help but notice. She never spoke ill of Trey to curious reporters who sometimes sought her out. She never corrected those who dismissed her as the former guardian in social situations. Instead, she carried her pain with the same strength that had sustained their family through years of poverty. In quiet moments, when the diner was empty and the night stretched long, Sarah would find herself humming the lullabies she used to sing to Trey. The melodies carried memories of simpler times of a small boy who once believed his mother hung the moon, of bedtime stories shared under blanket forts, of love that didn't need designer labels or social approval to be real. Her greatest fear wasn't losing him to wealth that had already happened. It was the possibility that one day, when the shine of his new life dulled and he needed the unconditional love only a mother could provide, she might not be strong enough to still be waiting. Yet each morning she rose before dawn, put on her uniform, and continued to love him from afar, believing that somewhere beneath the expensive suits and practiced smiles, her son was still there, waiting to find his way home. Brandon Bradley's influence over Trey grew like a carefully cultivated vine, slowly wrapping around every aspect of his new life. What began as casual mentorship in the ways of wealth evolved into something more insidious. Brandon, at 12, had mastered the art of social manipulation that his parents had practiced for years in corporate boardrooms. You know, Trey Brandon would say during their private brunches, not everyone can handle sudden wealth with proper grace. His words dripped with practiced concern, each syllable calculated for maximum impact. That's why you need guidance from those of us who understand the responsibilities of privilege. The transformation began subtly. Brandon introduced Trey to his family's private tailors, teaching him the subtle differences between merely expensive clothes and those that signaled old money status. "Notice how my father's suits are never obviously designer," he'd explain. "That's because true wealth whispers, it doesn't shout." Their friendship became a masterclass in social engineering. Brandon orchestrated Trey's social calendar, determining who was worthy of inclusion in their inner circle. Former friends were systematically excluded, their attempts at contact dismissed as social climbing. Even Amy Chen, who had shared her lunch with Trey during harder times, found herself quietly blacklisted. Brandon's influence extended into every corner of Trey's new life. He advised on staff hiring, suggesting his family's trusted personnel. Soon, Trey's household staff reported to Brandon as much as they did to their official employer. Information about Trey's daily activities, his visitors, and especially his interactions with Sarah flowed directly to Brandon's careful ears. Their shared social media presence became carefully choreographed performances. Brandon taught Trey the art of the calculated post, how to showcase wealth while appearing humble, how to reference privilege while seeming grateful. Each photo was staged, each caption vetted for maximum social impact. "Your mother's visits are becoming a bit frequent," Brandon mentioned one afternoon, watching Sarah leave the Coleman Arms. "People are starting to talk. Perhaps we should establish more appropriate boundaries." The suggestion was delivered with perfect concern, masking the manipulation beneath. The Bradley family's influence grew stronger as Richard and Victoria began including Trey in their social events. Private yacht parties, exclusive club memberships, and invitation-only charity galas filled his calendar. Each event pulled him further into their orbit, making Brandon's presence in his life seem not just natural but necessary. Brandon's most effective tool was isolation. He created an environment where Trey became increasingly dependent on his guidance. "Who else understands what it's like?" he would ask. "Who else knows the burden of maintaining proper social standing?" Each question reinforced the idea that only Brandon could help him navigate his new world. The emotional manipulation was subtle but constant. Brandon would praise Trey's adaptation to wealth one moment, then point out small social faux pas the next, creating a cycle of validation and criticism that kept Trey perpetually off balance. "You're doing so well," he would say, though that handshake with the mayor was a bit earnest. Their study sessions became lessons in power dynamics. Brandon taught Trey how to leverage his wealth for influence at school, how to ensure teachers' cooperation through carefully timed donations, how to maintain academic standing without appearing to try too hard. "Excellence is expected," Brandon would say, "but obvious effort is gauche." The relationship between them shifted from friendship to something more complex. Brandon became both mentor and gatekeeper, controlling Trey's access to the social world he desperately wanted to belong to. Each invitation, each introduction, each social opportunity came with strings that Brandon pulled with expert precision. Even Trey's personal spaces reflected Brandon's influence. His penthouse decor, his choice of art, his daily routines all bore the Bradley stamp of approval. The few remaining items from his past life were gradually removed, deemed inappropriate for his new status. Each change was suggested with such careful logic that Trey believed the decisions were his own. Brandon's most masterful manipulations centered on Trey's relationship with Sarah. He never openly criticized her, instead expressing concern about how her presence might complicate Trey's social development. "It's admirable how much you've overcome," he would say, letting the implications hang in the air. Their conversations increasingly focused on future plans, prep schools, college choices, business opportunities. Brandon painted pictures of a shared future where they would control corporate empires together, their childhood friendship evolving into powerful business alliances. Each discussion made their current dynamic seem more crucial, more permanent. Behind it all, Brandon maintained his own agenda, carefully hidden beneath layers of apparent friendship. His parents' business interests became increasingly entwined with Trey's trust fund investments. Social introductions led to business opportunities for Bradley development. Each connection strengthened their hold over the young millionaire's future. As autumn turned to winter, Brandon's influence reached its peak. Trey's decisions, his attitudes, even his dreams had been shaped by the Bradley heir's careful guidance. The transformation was so complete that few remembered the boy who had once counted pennies for lunch. In his place stood a carefully crafted reflection of Brandon Bradley's own privileged worldview. Yet in quiet moments when Brandon thought no one was watching, a different expression would cross his face, something calculating, almost predatory. These glimpses revealed the true nature of his influence, though Trey remained blind to them, too deeply enmeshed in the web of social manipulation to see its architect clearly. The first hint of Brandon's true intentions surfaced during a seemingly innocent conversation about Trey's trust fund investments. "You know," Brandon mentioned casually over their usual Sunday brunch, "Father's new development project could really use an angel investor. Someone young, visionary, someone like you." The suggestion came wrapped in friendship and future promises, but beneath lay something darker. Brandon's father, Richard Bradley, had begun appearing at Trey's financial meetings, offering investment advice that consistently steered towards Bradley development projects. Each suggestion was presented as an exclusive opportunity, a chance to join the inner circle of real estate development. Warning signs appeared in small details. Documents requiring Trey's signature began arriving during their social gatherings, presented between courses at dinner parties or during gaming sessions. The papers, thick with legal jargon, were explained away as routine paperwork by Brandon, who encouraged quick signatures to avoid spoiling the fun. Sarah, still watching from afar, noticed the increasing presence of Bradley development executives at Trey's penthouse. Through the diner's windows, she observed multiple late-night meetings, her son's small figure dwarfed by men in expensive suits. Each gathering left Trey looking more tired, less like himself. The manipulation extended to Trey's personal staff. His original financial advisor, recommended by the court, was gradually replaced by Bradley-approved consultants. His security team was upgraded to personnel from Bradley's private force. Even his personal chef was exchanged for one who served the Bradley family, ensuring Trey's daily routine aligned perfectly with Brandon's schedule. School became another battlefield of subtle control. Brandon orchestrated study groups that doubled as social screening sessions, determining which classmates could approach Trey. Academic projects mysteriously always paired them together, their presentations focusing increasingly on real estate development and investment strategies. Mr. Patterson, still running his corner store, observed the changes with growing concern. He noticed Bradley development representatives photographing his building, whispering about prime locations and property acquisition. When he mentioned this to Trey during a chance encounter, Brandon quickly steered his friend away, dismissing the old shopkeeper's concerns as small business paranoia. The transformation of Trey's social media presence became more pointed. Posts began featuring Bradley development properties with carefully worded captions about future investment opportunities and visionary development. Each photo op positioned Trey beside Brandon, their friendship presented as an unbreakable business alliance. Victoria Bradley's influence grew more pronounced, her charity galas becoming stages for public displays of Trey's integration into their world. She introduced him as practically family while simultaneously orchestrating situations that isolated him from his actual family. Each event pulled him deeper into their orbit, making the Bradleys seem indispensable to his success. Legal documents began appearing in Trey's mail proposals for joint ventures, investment opportunities, property acquisitions. All led back to Bradley development, each contract binding Trey's future more tightly to their empire. Brandon presented each document as another step toward their shared destiny, making any hesitation seem like a betrayal of their friendship. The pressure increased subtly but steadily. Brandon's compliments became conditional on Trey's compliance with Bradley family suggestions. Social invitations arrived with strings attached, each acceptance drawing him further into their web of influence. The once clear line between friendship and business began to blur. Mrs. Henderson, watching from her apartment window, noticed men in suits examining their building structure, taking measurements, discussing demolition costs. When she mentioned this to Trey, Brandon quickly appeared, shepherding him away with practiced ease. Old buildings, old people, he remarked later, both eventually need to be replaced. Trey's personal accounts began showing unusual activity, large transfers to Bradley-controlled entities, investments in their subsidiaries, donations to their preferred charities. Each transaction was explained away as strategic positioning or social responsibility. The numbers lost in a maze of financial jargon that Trey struggled to understand. The betrayal crystallized in small moments: Brandon's quick glances at his phone when Trey shared personal information, the way conversations steered inevitably toward business opportunities, the subtle pressure to distance himself from anyone outside their circle. Yet Trey, desperate to belong, convinced himself these were normal aspects of wealthy friendship. Sarah, serving coffee to Bradley development executives, overheard snippets of conversation about the Smith acquisition and securing the trust fund. She watched helplessly as her son became entangled in a web of adult manipulation, his newfound wealth making him a target for those who had once dismissed him. Late at night, Brandon's mask occasionally slipped. During video game sessions or casual conversations, hints of his true nature emerged, calculated comments about Trey's youthful naivety or the convenience of their friendship. These moments passed quickly, buried under layers of manufactured camaraderie and shared secrets. The final warning sign came disguised as a celebration. Brandon organized a lavish party in Trey's penthouse, inviting their entire social circle. As cameras flashed and social media posts multiplied, contracts were passed around, signatures gathered, deals sealed. Each document represented another piece of Trey's independence surrendered to the Bradley empire, all in the name of friendship and future success. Yet through it all, Trey remained blind to the manipulation, seeing only the friendship he desperately wanted to believe in. Each step toward the Bradleys felt like a step up the social ladder, each signature another brick in the foundation of his new life. The trap was closing, but to its willing prisoner it looked like a golden opportunity. The truth began to unravel on a rainy Tuesday evening during one of the Bradley family's elaborate dinner parties. Trey, dressed in his finest suit, sat at their mahogany dining table, surrounded by the trappings of wealth he'd come to see as normal. The conversation flowed like the expensive wine being served to the adults until Richard Bradley's phone rang. The Smith Trust Fund transfer is complete. Richard's voice carried from his study, where he'd stepped away to take the call. The boy signed everything last week. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the assets will be untraceable. He chuckled. unaware that Trey had wandered near the study's open door, looking for the bathroom. Trey froze, his world tilting on its axis. Brandon appeared beside him, his usual smooth smile replaced by something colder. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he said quietly, "though I suppose it doesn't matter now. Everything's already done." The elaborate nature of the scheme became clear as Trey demanded answers. Brandon, perhaps tired of pretending, laid out the plan with cruel precision. Every friendship, every invitation, every piece of financial advice had been carefully orchestrated. The Bradley family had spent months positioning themselves to gain control of his lottery winnings through a complex web of shell companies and fraudulent investments. "Did you really think we'd let some scholarship charity case join our world?" Brandon's mask finally dropped completely. "You were useful, Trey, your trust fund even more so. But let's be honest, you never belonged here." Each word struck like a physical blow, shattering the illusions Trey had built around their friendship. The documentation, when Trey finally understood what he'd been signing, was damning. His signature appeared on papers transferring control of his assets to Bradley-owned companies. Investment agreements gave them voting rights over his trust fund. Even his penthouse lease had been restructured to make him essentially a tenant in his own home. Victoria Bradley swept into the study, her social smile never wavering. "Oh dear," she said, noting Trey's ashen face. "I suppose the cat's out of the bag. You really should have had a proper financial advisor review those documents, darling. But then again, your background hardly prepared you for handling significant wealth." The betrayal cut deeper as Trey realized how completely he'd been manipulated. Every major decision in the past months had been guided by Brandon's suggestions. His isolation from Sarah, his dismissal of old friends, his increasing dependence on the Bradleys, all part of their calculated plan. "Your mother suspected something," Brandon mentioned casually, examining his manicured nails. "She tried to warn you, remember? But you were too busy playing Millionaire to listen. Quite convenient for us, really." The memory of Sarah's concerned faces during her abbreviated visits now carried new weight. Security personnel, Bradley employees, Trey now realized, appeared at the study door. Richard Bradley joined them, his businessman's facade firmly in place. "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave, Trey. The party's over in more ways than one." The same men who had once protected Trey now moved to escort him out. In a final twist of cruelty, Brandon held up his phone, showing social media posts carefully documenting Trey's reckless spending and increasingly erratic behavior. The narrative had been built gradually, laying groundwork for what would appear to be a tragic but predictable fall from grace. "We own the story now," Brandon explained, his voice carrying the same instructional tone he'd used when teaching Trey about wine pairings and social etiquette. "Poor lottery winner loses everything through bad decisions and inexperience. The media loves cautionary tales like that." As Trey was led through the Bradley mansion, past guests who now avoided his gaze, he caught fragments of new conversations. Business associates congratulating Richard on his acquisition, society mothers clucking sympathetically about new money never lasting. His entire world had become a stage set, and he'd been merely a prop in someone else's play. Outside, rain soaked through his expensive suit as security deposited him on the sidewalk. Through the mansion's windows, he could see the party continuing without pause. Brandon raised a glass in mock salute, surrounded by the same friends who had once claimed to embrace Trey as one of their own. The most painful realization wasn't the loss of money, it was understanding how completely he'd betrayed himself. Every step away from his true identity, every rejection of his mother's love, every dismissal of loyal friends had been orchestrated by those who saw him not as a person to nurture, but as an asset to acquire. Standing in the rain, Trey finally saw the Bradley mansion for what it was, not a symbol of the life he wanted, but a monument to the values that had nearly destroyed him. The same windows that had once represented his dreams now revealed the hollow reality of the world he tried so desperately to join. His phone buzzed with notifications, his accounts being systematically locked, his access to the penthouse revoked, his credit cards cancelled. The Bradley machine moved with brutal efficiency, dismantling the life they had helped him build. Each alert represented another piece of his false identity being stripped away. Through the deluge, Trey could see lights on in his old apartment building. His mother would be home from her evening shift at the diner, probably warming up leftover spaghetti, worrying about him as she had every day since his transformation began. The distance between them now seemed vast, but for the first time in months he knew which direction led home. The media storm broke with devastating precision the morning after Trey's expulsion from the Bradley mansion. Headlines screamed across local newspapers: lottery winners fall from grace and child millionaire squanders fortune. Each story painted a carefully crafted narrative of reckless spending and poor judgment, conveniently ignoring the sophisticated manipulation behind his downfall. Brandon's social media campaign launched simultaneously, flooding platforms with carefully selected photos and videos. Clips of Trey's most extravagant moments, stripped of context, portrayed him as an out-of-control child desperate to buy acceptance. Comments from concerned friends expressed worry about his increasingly erratic behavior and dangerous spending habits. The Preston Elementary Parents Group chat exploded with speculation and judgment. Mothers who had once begged for playdates now shared whispered concerns about their children's association with him. Teachers who had praised his maturity began recalling troubling incidents that suddenly seemed significant in hindsight. Local news vans camped outside both the Coleman Arms and Sarah's apartment building. Reporters ambushed her as she left for work, shoving microphones in her face while asking loaded questions. Did you see signs of your son's spending addiction? Were there early indicators of his inability to handle wealth? Each query twisted the knife deeper. Victoria Bradley gave a masterfully crafted interview to the city's most prestigious newspaper. We tried to guide him, she sighed, perfectly rehearsed tears glistening. But some people simply aren't prepared for the responsibilities of wealth. Perhaps if he'd had a more stable upbringing. The character assassination was elegant, thorough, and completely deniable. Anonymous sources began feeding stories to tabloids about wild parties, outrageous purchases, and questionable investments. Each tale contained just enough truth to seem plausible, wrapped in layers of exaggeration and outright lies. The Bradley name was never mentioned, except as concerned family friends watching a tragedy unfold. Trey's former staff, now revealed as Bradley Plants, contributed their own stories. His personal chef detailed obsessive demands for expensive dishes. His driver described late-night adventures that never happened. Each betrayal was carefully orchestrated to support the narrative of a child corrupted by sudden wealth. Professional reputations were weaponized against him. The court-appointed financial advisor, who had been gradually excluded from decisions, now faced allegations of negligence, the suggestion that he should have prevented Trey's reckless spending. Conveniently ignored the Bradley family's systematic removal of all independent oversight. Social media influencers, secretly compensated by Bradley-owned companies, turned Trey's story into viral content. Memes mocked his fall from grace. Video essays analyzed his journey from rags to riches to rags, each garnering millions of views. His humiliation became entertainment, his pain transformed into clickbait. Sarah watched helplessly as her son's reputation was systematically destroyed. Her attempts to defend him were dismissed as a mother's blind loyalty, or, worse, portrayed as attempts to regain access to wealth she'd never actually sought. Her own past was scrutinized, every struggle reframed as evidence of poor parenting rather than determination. The legal documents Trey had signed under Brandon's guidance now emerged as evidence of his poor judgment. Each contract, carefully worded by Bradley lawyers, appeared to show willing participation in increasingly risky ventures. His signature on papers he hadn't understood became proof of his unfitness to manage wealth. Former classmates from his scholarship days were approached by reporters offering payment for negative stories. Most refused, but a few, remembering their own hurts and jealousies, contributed to the narrative. Old incidents were reshaped into warning signs, normal childhood moments twisted into evidence of character flaws. The Bradley family's financial takeover was presented as a necessary intervention, a responsible adult response to a child's spiraling behavior. Business publications praised their strategic acquisition, while social columns commended their friendship and concern for a troubled young man. Charity organizations that had once celebrated Trey's donations now distanced themselves, some even returning funds to avoid association with the scandal. The same galas that had welcomed him as a young philanthropist now closed their doors, his name quietly removed from donor lists and dedication plaques. Mrs. Henderson attempted to speak out about the Bradleys' true nature, about their plans for the neighborhood and their manipulation of Trey. Her concerns were quickly buried under legal threats and public relations spin, her voice lost in the carefully orchestrated chaos of accusations and innuendo. The final blow came in the form of a psychological evaluation commissioned by the Bradleys through their connections. Without ever meeting Trey, the report suggested patterns of compulsive behavior and emotional instability. This professional opinion provided seeming validation for every accusation, every criticism, every betrayal. As the scandal peaked, Trey found himself trapped in a narrative he couldn't control. His phone was flooded with messages from former friends expressing disappointment in his choices. Social media accounts he no longer controlled continued posting in his name, each message carefully crafted to support the story of his downfall. The truth of systematic manipulation, of calculated betrayal, of adult predators targeting a child's fortune remained buried beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The media feast on his destruction continued, each new revelation pushing him further from the possibility of redemption in the public eye. Yet in the midst of this orchestrated chaos, small acts of loyalty emerged. Mr. Patterson kept his store open late, providing a safe haven when reporters became too aggressive. Amy Chen's family offered their restaurant's back room as a quiet space away from cameras. These glimpses of genuine friendship stood in stark contrast to the artificial world that had betrayed him. The legal nightmare began with a series of early morning phone calls that systematically cut off Trey's access to his own fortune. His bank accounts were frozen, credit cards deactivated, and investment accounts locked under the guise of protecting assets during investigation. Each notification arrived with the cold precision of a well-orchestrated attack. Bradley Development's lawyers moved with ruthless efficiency, filing motions that questioned Trey's competency to manage his wealth. Their legal documents painted a picture of a reckless child whose spending habits necessitated adult intervention. Emergency hearings were scheduled, judges approached through carefully cultivated connections, and the machinery of justice began turning against its youngest participant. The courthouse became a battlefield where Trey found himself outgunned and outmaneuvered. Richard Bradley's legal team arrived in force 6 attorneys from the city's most prestigious firm, each billing more per hour than Sarah made in a week. They presented binders of evidence, social media posts showing extravagant purchases, carefully edited security footage suggesting erratic behavior, witness statements from staff members on Bradley's payroll. Sarah scraped together enough money to hire a young lawyer, fresh out of law school, who took the case at a reduced rate. But against the Bradley legal machine, their efforts felt like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. Each motion they filed was met with a barrage of counter-motions, each argument drowned in a sea of legal precedents and procedural objections. The trust fund, which had been Trey's financial safety net, became a weapon used against him. Bradley's lawyers argued that his pattern of irresponsible decisions necessitated immediate adult oversight. They presented contracts Trey had signed under Brandon's guidance as evidence of his inability to manage money, conveniently omitting the manipulation that led to those signatures. Court appearances became exercises in humiliation. Trey sat in oversized chairs while adults debated his competency, his character, his future. The same judges who had approved his lottery winnings now nodded sympathetically as Bradley's lawyers suggested he needed protection from himself. Each hearing chipped away at his autonomy, his dignity, his right to control his own destiny. Financial forensics revealed a web of transactions so complex that even experienced auditors struggled to follow the money trail. Bradley Development had created a maze of shell companies and subsidiary investments, each transaction technically legal but morally bankrupt. Trey's signature appeared on documents whose implications he couldn't have understood, all witnessed and notarized by Bradley employees. The freeze on his assets left Trey suddenly penniless. The irony of returning to poverty was bitter this time, not from lack of money, but from inability to access what was legally his. His attempt to withdraw enough for lunch money was denied, the bank teller who had once fawned over him now avoiding eye contact as she explained the account restrictions. Sarah's attorney discovered patterns in the legal assault that suggested long-term planning. The Bradleys had begun positioning themselves months before, establishing connections with key court officials, building relationships with influential judges, preparing the groundwork for their eventual takeover. Each revelation highlighted how thoroughly they had orchestrated Trey's downfall. The media coverage of the legal proceedings added another layer of pain. Courtroom artists captured Trey's diminishing frame in harsh strokes, making him appear smaller and more vulnerable with each appearance. News reports focused on the sad necessity of removing financial control from a child who had lost his way, never questioning the motivations of those seeking that control. Emergency motions filed by Sarah's lawyer were dismissed with bureaucratic efficiency. Requests for temporary access to funds for basic necessities were denied. Even attempts to separate Trey's personal belongings from disputed assets met with legal roadblocks, leaving him without access to clothes, school supplies, or personal items still locked in his former penthouse. The Bradley legal team introduced a psychological component to their strategy, suggesting that Trey's spending addiction indicated deeper mental health issues requiring professional intervention. Their pet psychiatrist, having never met Trey, nevertheless provided expert testimony about the dangers of allowing him any financial autonomy. Property managers, acting on Bradley Development's instructions, changed locks and security codes, effectively barring Trey from accessing his former residences. His belongings became evidence in the ongoing legal proceedings, held hostage by a system that had turned against him. Even his school uniforms remained locked away, deemed part of the asset inventory under review. Sarah watched helplessly as her son's fortune became a weapon used to destroy him. The legal fees for their modest defense mounted quickly, forcing her to pick up extra shifts and consider selling their few remaining valuable possessions. Each small victory their lawyer managed to achieve was immediately appealed by Bradley's team, dragging out proceedings and draining their limited resources. The final blow came when Bradley Development filed for emergency conservatorship, seeking to take full legal control of Trey's assets for his own protection. The motion, hundreds of pages long and supported by carefully curated evidence, represented the culmination of their strategy, the complete legal erasure of Trey's right to his own fortune. Through it all, Trey began to understand the true cost of his earlier choices. The friends he had dismissed, the values he had abandoned, the mother he had pushed away all now stood in stark contrast to the artificial world that had seduced and betrayed him. Each legal setback stripped away another layer of his acquired identity, gradually revealing the boy he had been before wealth changed everything. In the darkest hour of their legal battle, Sarah Smith made a decision that would change everything, standing in front of Mr. Goldman's pawn shop for what would be the last time. She clutched a small velvet bag containing her final treasures, her nursing school pin, James's wedding band that she'd managed to keep, and a gold locket containing photos of Trey as a baby. The decision hadn't come easily. Sarah had spent nights poring over old nursing textbooks, studying laws and regulations until her eyes burned. She discovered a loophole in the Bradleys' legal strategy, but exploiting it would require resources they didn't have. The retainer fee alone for a specialized attorney would cost more than she made in 6 months. "They're family heirlooms," she explained to Mr. Goldman, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I know they're not worth much in dollars, but—" The old pawnbroker, who had watched their family's decline through a series of increasingly desperate transactions, raised his hand to stop her. What happened next showcased the power of community over wealth. Mr. Goldman made some calls. Within hours, Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant had emptied her savings. Mr. Patterson contributed his store's emergency fund. Mrs. Henderson organized a collection among the apartment residents. Even the diner's regular customers, learning of Sarah's plight, left extra tips marked for the legal fund. The sacrifices extended beyond money. Sarah took on additional shifts, working 20-hour days that left her barely able to stand. She sold their furniture, slept on the floor, ate nothing but discounted day-old bread. Each sacrifice was measured not in dollars saved, but in chances to save her son. The most painful sacrifice came when she sold her nursing license. A private clinic offered cash for her credentials illegal, but desperately needed. The decision meant abandoning any hope of returning to her profession, but Sarah signed the papers without hesitation. A mother's job, she told her tearful reflection, is to protect her child, whatever the cost. Word of Sarah's sacrifices spread through the neighborhood. Former patients from her nursing days appeared with small contributions. Eleanor's old teaching colleagues organized fundraisers. The community that Trey had abandoned in his pursuit of wealth now rallied around his mother's desperate effort to save him. These sacrifices didn't go unnoticed by Trey. Through the legal chaos, he watched his mother strip away every comfort, every dream, every possibility of her own future. The woman who had once cared for others as a nurse now cleaned offices at night, her hands raw from cheap cleaning products, all to fund his defense. The turning point came when Sarah made her final and most public sacrifice. During a crucial court hearing, she took the stand and laid bare their entire history. She exposed her own struggles, mistakes, and fears, sacrificing her privacy and dignity to show the court the true nature of their family's story. "I'm not a perfect mother," she testified, her waitress uniform stark against the formal courtroom attire surrounding her. "But everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been for my son." Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 sacrificed dreams, each word backed by years of proven devotion. The contrast between Sarah's sacrifice and the Bradleys' manipulation became impossible to ignore. While they deployed teams of lawyers and PR specialists, Sarah sold her blood plasma between shifts to pay for court filings. While they hosted strategy meetings in luxury offices, she skipped meals to afford photocopies of evidence. The community's response to Sarah's sacrifices created a ripple effect. Local media, initially seduced by the Bradleys' narrative, began investigating the other side of the story. Photos of Sarah leaving her third job at midnight, still in her diner uniform, told a different story than the Bradleys' carefully crafted press releases. Her sacrifice extended to her own health. The punishing schedule and inadequate nutrition took their toll, but Sarah refused medical attention, saving every penny for the legal battle. When she collapsed during a court recess, her first words upon waking were about the next filing deadline. The most powerful moment came when Sarah offered to surrender her parental rights if it would guarantee Trey's financial independence from the Bradleys. This ultimate sacrifice, giving up her son to save him, stunned the courtroom into silence. Even the Bradleys' lawyers paused, momentarily stripped of their rehearsed responses. And throughout it all, Sarah never lost sight of her goal. Each sacrifice was a step toward saving not just Trey's fortune, but his soul. She recognized that the true battle wasn't for money, but for her son's future, his chance to become the person James had dreamed he would be. As news of Sarah's sacrifices spread, they began to shift the narrative. The story was no longer about a reckless child's mishandling of wealth, but about a mother's unstoppable love confronting corporate greed. Each new revelation of her sacrifices chipped away at the Bradleys' carefully constructed facade. The final sacrifice came when Sarah discovered the ultimate piece of evidence against the Bradleys, but accessing it would require sacrificing their last chance at financial stability. Without hesitation, she made the choice, understanding that saving her son's future was worth any price. The full extent of Trey's financial devastation became clear on a cold Monday morning, as he stood outside the Coleman Arms watching security remove his belongings. His possessions, designer clothes, custom furniture, imported electronics, were unceremoniously piled on the sidewalk like expensive garbage. The same doorman who had once bowed to his every whim now stood guard, preventing him from entering what had been his home. Each credit card declined in succession as he attempted to book even the cheapest hotel room. His phone buzzed constantly with overdraft notices and account closure alerts. The Bradleys' legal machine had moved with ruthless efficiency, freezing or transferring every asset he had once controlled. Even his school lunch account had been suspended, leaving him unable to buy a simple sandwich. The penthouse that had symbolized his rise now became a monument to his fall. Through its gleaming windows, he could see workers systematically dismantling the life he had built. Art pieces were carefully wrapped for storage. Electronics disconnected, even his clothes sorted for asset evaluation. Each item disappeared into the machinery of legal proceedings, labeled and logged as evidence of his fiscal irresponsibility. Brandon watched from his family's mansion, occasionally appearing at windows to observe Trey's humiliation with clinical interest. The same social media accounts that had once documented their friendship now carried subtle messages about learning from others' mistakes. And the importance of proper financial guidance. Each post twisted the knife deeper. Sarah found Trey sitting on their old apartment steps, surrounded by shopping bags filled with what little he had managed to save from the penthouse. Designer suits that no longer seemed to fit, Italian shoes that had lost their shine, a phone that would soon be disconnected. The labels that had once seemed so important now looked garish in the harsh morning light. The financial destruction extended beyond mere possessions. College funds had vanished, investment accounts were drained, and even the basic trust established by the Lottery Commission had been expertly dismantled through a series of complex legal maneuvers. The Bradleys hadn't just taken his money, they had systematically erased his financial future. Their old apartment, which had seemed so confining after his wealth, now represented their only shelter. But even this modest refuge was threatened. The building's sale to Bradley Development was proceeding, with eviction notices expected any day. The same wealth that had lifted them out of poverty was now, through cruel irony, about to make them homeless. Bills arrived with merciless regularity: legal fees, court costs, penalties for broken contracts. Each envelope represented another piece of their future being chipped away. Sarah's salary from the diner couldn't begin to cover the mounting expenses. Even selling everything they owned would barely make a dent in the growing debt. The school scholarship committee met to re-evaluate Trey's status. His tuition, previously paid in full through his trust fund, was now in arrears. The same administrators who had praised his generous donations now spoke in whispers about maintaining academic standards and financial obligations. Each conversation carried the weight of impending expulsion. Local businesses that had once competed for his patronage now posted his photo behind counters, warning staff about declined cards and unpaid bills. The same restaurants where he had hosted elaborate dinner parties now turned him away at the door. His credit score, though he was too young to fully understand its importance, had been destroyed so thoroughly it would take decades to rebuild. The personal cost was equally devastating. His expensive phone plan was cut off, designer clothes couldn't be dry cleaned, and the basic luxuries he had taken for granted, like ordering takeout or taking cabs, became impossible. Each small deprivation reminded him of how completely his world had changed. Sarah watched helplessly as her son confronted poverty for the second time in his young life. This time was harder. He had tasted wealth, lived in luxury, experienced the power that money could buy. Returning to their simple life of careful budgeting and coupon clipping seemed like a cruel punishment rather than the normal existence it had once been. Mr. Patterson offered Trey a job stocking shelves at his store, but even this small lifeline came with complications. The Bradleys' lawyers argued that any income he earned should be directed toward his mounting legal fees. Every attempt to rebuild was met with new obstacles, each small step forward countered by legal roadblocks. The final indignity came in the form of a court order freezing even the small checking account Sarah had maintained for household expenses. The Bradleys' lawyers argued that any family assets might be used to hide Trey's funds. With this last blow, they found themselves in a position worse than their original poverty. Now they were not just poor, but actively prevented from helping themselves. The social death was almost worse than the financial ruin. Preston Elementary, once the stage for Trey's transformation into a young philanthropist, became a daily gauntlet of whispers and pointed fingers. Former friends crossed hallways to avoid him, their designer shoes squeaking against floors his donations had helped install. Brandon orchestrated the social isolation with surgical precision. Each day brought new humiliations. Trey's name disappeared from party invite lists, group chats fell silent when he appeared, lunch tables suddenly became reserved when he approached. The same children who had once competed for his attention now treated him like a cautionary tale. Social media became a weapon of mass humiliation. Old photos were recirculated with mocking captions, past conversations screenshotted and shared out of context. The hashtag TreysmithFail began trending locally, each post another digital dagger in his already wounded pride. His attempts to defend himself were met with screenshots of his own boastful posts from more affluent days. The school administration's response only deepened his isolation. Teachers who had once praised his generosity now watched him with wary eyes, as if poverty might be contagious. His scholarship status was under review, each meeting peppered with terms like behavioral concerns. And financial responsibility, the same office where he had once presented donation checks now barely acknowledged his existence. Sarah's presence at school events became another source of shame. Other parents physically moved away when she approached, their designer handbags clutched closer as if her waitress uniform might soil them. The PTA meetings where she had once served refreshments now featured discussions about maintaining community standards, thinly veiled references to families like theirs. Even their old neighbors, who had once celebrated Trey's lottery win, now avoided eye contact in hallways. The community that had supported them through years of poverty seemed unsure how to handle their spectacular fall from grace. Mrs. Henderson alone maintained her friendship, though even her kindness felt like another mark of their social descent. The daily walk to school became an exercise in endurance. Passing the Coleman Arms, where he had once lived in luxury, Trey would see his former doorman pointedly turning away. The coffee shop where he had hosted morning meetings now displayed a small sign, "Right to refuse service." Each step marked another boundary he could no longer cross. Brandon's final social execution came during a school assembly. As Trey entered the auditorium, an entire section of seats suddenly needed reservation for special guests. He stood awkwardly in the aisle until a teacher directed him to sit with the custodial staff's children, a deliberate reminder of his new social status. The Bradley mansion's lights mocked him each evening, parties continuing as if he had never existed. Through its windows, he could see his former friends enjoying the life he had briefly tasted. Sometimes Brandon would appear on the balcony, raising a glass in mock salute to Trey's darkened apartment below. Local businesses that had once welcomed him now posted his photo with various warnings. The same shops where he had dropped thousands on impulse buys now watched him suspiciously if he so much as browsed. His attempts to return items from his wealthy days were met with skepticism and often outright refusal. The shame extended to Sarah's workplace. Regular customers at the diner now left comments about raising children right within her earshot. Some refused to be served by her, claiming they couldn't support irresponsible parenting. Each shift became an exercise in swallowing pride while serving those who had cast her family out. College counseling sessions, once focused on elite boarding schools and prestigious academies, now centered on community college options and financial aid. The same counselor who had helped him draft admission essays to private schools now suggested more realistic paths. Each meeting reinforced the message his future had shrunk along with his bank account. And the local papers, which had once celebrated his rags to riches story, now ran features analyzing his downfall. The price of pride and when money ruins became common headlines, each article a fresh autopsy of his failures. His attempts to share his side of the story were dismissed as typical entitlement. In the school cafeteria, his free lunch status was reinstated with humiliating publicity. The same cashier who had once processed his generous donations to other students' accounts now loudly announced his meal status. The irony of returning to the very situation that had once marked him as an outsider was lost on no one. The final blow to his social standing came when his former tutor posted a viral video detailing his attitude problems and impossible demands. The commentary thread filled with similar stories, each more exaggerated than the last, creating a crowd-sourced narrative of his unworthiness. His fall from grace was complete, documented in likes and shares for all to see. The truth about Sarah's living situation emerged on a frigid November morning. Trey, walking to school earlier than usual, spotted a familiar car in the back lot of Chuck's diner. Through the frosted windows, he could make out a figure huddled under blankets in the back seat, his mother, trying to catch a few hours of sleep between shifts. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. The passenger seat was filled with neatly hung uniforms: diner, cleaning service, convenience store. The trunk, slightly ajar, revealed stacks of job applications and legal documents. A small battery-operated lamp sat on the dashboard, surrounded by carefully arranged photos of him at different ages. Sarah had kept this secret for weeks, ever since their eviction from the apartment. She maintained appearances by using the diner's staff room to change, storing most of their remaining possessions in Mr. Patterson's storage room, and telling Trey she was staying with a friend from work. Each lie had been crafted to protect him from the full extent of their circumstances. Evidence of her efforts to maintain dignity was everywhere. A small mirror hung from the rear view, where she applied makeup each morning to hide her exhaustion. A thermos of instant coffee sat in the cup holder, helping her stay awake through multiple shifts. Her nursing textbooks were still tucked under the seat, a reminder of dreams sacrificed for survival. The car itself told a story of careful organization in the face of homelessness. Clean uniforms hung on a makeshift rod stretched across the back windows. A small box contained basic toiletries and medications. Everything was meticulously arranged to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as their world had crumbled. Trey watched as Sarah stirred, her body stiff from another night of uncomfortable sleep. She quickly checked her reflection, straightened her uniform, and stepped out into the cold morning air, unaware of her son's presence. Her movements were practiced, suggesting this routine had been established long before he discovered it. The sight of her preparing for another day of work, acting as if sleeping in a car was perfectly normal, broke something in Trey. This was the woman who had once dreamed of returning to nursing, who had worked multiple jobs to keep him in a good school, who had somehow maintained her dignity through years of poverty only to end up here because of his choices. Sarah's small actions revealed the depth of her sacrifice. She had positioned the car carefully under a streetlight for safety, but far enough from the road to avoid attention. A gym membership card on the dash explained how she managed to shower and maintain appearances. Every detail spoke of a mother's determination to protect her child's remaining stability. Later that day, Trey returned to investigate further. The car's contents told a fuller story. Unpaid bills were neatly stacked in the glove compartment, each one marked with careful notes about payment plans. A calendar tracked her various jobs, showing shifts that left barely any time for sleep. A small photo album contained pictures of their family in happier times, its pages worn from frequent handling. Most heartbreaking were the small signs of hope she maintained. A newspaper clipping about adult education programs was bookmarked. Job listings for nursing positions were highlighted, despite her current circumstances making such opportunities seem impossible. Even in her darkest moment, Sarah was still planning for a better future. The real gut punch came when Trey found a birthday card addressed to him, already purchased and written for his upcoming birthday. Despite living in her car, despite barely having enough money for food, she had still made sure to maintain their traditions. The card's message spoke of pride and love, with no hint of blame for their current situation. That evening, Trey watched from a distance as Sarah returned to the car after her final shift. She moved with the weary grace of someone who had accepted their circumstances but refused to be broken by them. Through the window, he could see her taking out his old teddy bear, the one he had discarded during his wealthy days, and holding it close before trying to sleep. The temperature dropped sharply that night. From his hidden position, Trey saw his mother adding layers of clothes rather than running the car heater, saving gas money for emergencies. The sight of her sacrificing basic comfort, while he had once complained about thread counts in Egyptian cotton sheets, felt like a knife in his heart. As he finally turned away, Trey noticed something that crystallized the full tragedy of their situation. On the car's backseat lay a copy of Financial Planning for Dummies. Not for her benefit, but because she was still trying to understand where she had gone wrong, still trying to figure out how to protect him from further mistakes. Even homeless, even exhausted, Sarah was still focused on being the mother he needed. The breaking point came in the empty school cafeteria after hours. Trey sat alone at the table where he had once held court with his wealthy friends, the reality of his mother sleeping in her car, finally shattering his carefully maintained composure. The sobs started quietly, then built into gut-wrenching howls that echoed through the empty space. Memories flooded back with merciless clarity. Every dismissive gesture towards Sarah, every time he had treated her like an embarrassment, every moment he had chosen his false friends over her unconditional love. The weight of his betrayal crashed over him in waves, each realization more painful than the last. He remembered her face when he had rejected her homemade spaghetti, claiming it wasn't sophisticated enough for his new lifestyle. Now the thought of her carefully preparing meals in the cramped space of her car, probably going hungry to save money, made him physically ill. He found himself retching in the same trash can where he had once tossed her lovingly packed lunches. The designer clothes he wore suddenly felt like a costume, each expensive thread a reminder of his foolishness. He clawed at his silk tie, ripped the branded blazer from his shoulders, kicked off the Italian leather shoes that had cost more than a month's rent. Each item represented another moment he had chosen appearance over authenticity, wealth over love. Through tear-blurred eyes, he saw his reflection in the cafeteria windows, no longer the polished young socialite, but a broken child who had lost his way. The carefully styled hair, the practiced posture, the artificial smile he had perfected under Brandon's tutelage, all of it crumbled away, leaving only the raw truth of who he had become. His father's journal, rescued from the trash and returned by Sarah, fell from his bag. The pages opened to James's dreams for his unborn son, hopes not of wealth or status, but of kindness, integrity, and the courage to stand up for others. Each word was a judgment on the person Trey had chosen to become. Memories of Eleanor surfaced next her gentle wisdom, her belief in the power of love over money. He remembered her wedding ring, pawned by Sarah to pay their rent, now probably adorning someone else's finger while his mother slept in a car. The shame of it brought fresh waves of tears, each sob a confession of how far he had strayed from his grandmother's teachings. The sound of the janitor's keys brought a moment of clarity. Mr. Washington, Marcus's father, stood in the doorway, understanding dawning on his face as he took in the scene. Without a word, he sat beside Trey, offering the same quiet dignity that his son had shown when Trey had rejected their friendship for wealthier companions. Your mother, Mr. Washington said softly, still cleans this floor every night after her diner shift. Never complained, never stopped hoping you'd find your way back. The simple statement broke something final in Trey's carefully constructed walls. The truth of his mother's endless sacrifice, contrasted with his own selfish choices, became impossible to deny. Through his breakdown, memories of recent months played like a cruel movie. Sarah defending him to reporters while wearing her waitress uniform. Sarah skipping meals but ensuring he had lunch money. Sarah maintaining her dignity while sleeping in a car, still trying to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. The realization of what true wealth meant came too late. While he had been chasing designer labels and social status, his mother had demonstrated the real meaning of richness, love, sacrifice, unwavering support. She had given everything, asked for nothing, and continued to believe in him even when he had stopped believing in himself. His phone buzzed with messages from Brandon mocking, cruel reminders of his fall from grace. But now these digital barbs felt meaningless compared to the image of his mother trying to sleep in her car, still holding onto his old teddy bear. The contrast between false friendship and true love had never been clearer. Standing shakily, Trey gathered his discarded clothes, not to wear them, but as reminders of his mistakes. Each item represented a lesson learned at too high a price. His mother's sacrifice had bought these truths with her comfort, her dignity, her dreams. The least he could do was learn from them. In the growing darkness of the cafeteria, Trey Smith finally understood what his mother had known all along, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, sold, or stolen by the Bradleys of the world. With this realization came another, more painful truth: understanding meant nothing without action. His breakdown had shown him the way. What mattered now was finding the courage to walk it. The tide began to turn in an unlikely place, the basement of Patterson's Market, where former classmates had gathered in secret. Amy Chen, Marcus Washington, and others who had been cast aside during Trey's wealthy days sat in a circle, surrounded by boxes of evidence they had quietly collected over months. "Look at this," Amy said, spreading documents across a makeshift table. Her parents' restaurant had catered several Bradley events, giving her access to conversations never meant for public ears. They were planning this before Trey even won the lottery. She produced receipts, photographs, and overheard conversations meticulously documented in her notebook. Marcus, whose father's janitorial position at Preston Elementary provided after-hours access to the school's records, contributed his own findings. The donations from Bradley Development to the school board started the same week Trey won. Every major decision about his trust fund went through committees where they had planted their people. The small group had grown into an unlikely investigation team. Children who had once been invisible to their wealthy classmates now became their most powerful allies. Each brought unique access to information through their parents' service jobs, positions the Bradleys had deemed too insignificant to notice. Lisa Martinez, the cafeteria worker's daughter, had collected security footage showing Brandon's systematic isolation of Trey. "Watch how they orchestrated every social interaction," she explained, pointing to carefully timed encounters that now revealed their calculated nature. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Anderson, the son of a Bradley Development janitor, had discovered documents left carelessly in office trash bins. Shredded papers, painstakingly reconstructed, revealed the elaborate scheme to manipulate Trey's trust fund through shell companies. Their evidence, mounted in carefully organized files, maintenance workers had recorded suspicious meetings, housekeepers had photographed incriminating documents, chauffeurs had logged revealing conversations. The very people the Bradleys had ignored became their undoing. Sarah arrived one evening to find this unlikely team working late into the night. These children, whom society had taught to be invisible, had chosen to become visible in defense of someone who had once rejected them. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Mr. Patterson provided more than just space for their meetings. His years of running a corner store had given him a network of connections throughout the neighborhood. Small business owners, service workers, and community members who had witnessed the Bradleys' systematic destruction of local businesses began adding their testimonies. The children worked with a determination that shamed their adult counterparts. Amy's coding skills, learned in free library classes, helped decrypt financial records. Marcus's photography hobby provided crucial documentation. Each contributed what they could, their combined skills creating a powerful force. Mrs. Chen's restaurant became their second headquarters. The back room transformed into a war room where they coordinated their efforts. The same parents who had once worked in the shadows of the Bradley empire now emerged as key witnesses to its corruption. Their investigation revealed patterns that adults had missed. Through the unfiltered eyes of children, the Bradleys' manipulation became clear how they had isolated Trey, controlled his information, and systematically stripped away his support system. The team grew as more students joined their cause. Even some of Trey's former wealthy friends, seeing the truth behind Brandon's facade, began quietly passing information. The wall of silence around the Bradley empire developed crucial cracks. Sarah watched these children work with tears in her eyes. They showed her printed emails, surveillance footage, financial records, each piece a small part of the larger truth. These kids, whom society had taught to expect little, were proving capable of extraordinary things. Most powerful was their motivation. None sought revenge or personal gain. Instead, they were driven by a simple understanding of right and wrong, uncomplicated by adult cynicism. They saw injustice and chose to fight it, regardless of social cost. "We're not doing this because we expect anything," Amy explained one night, sorting through more documents. "We're doing it because it's right." The others nodded, their faces serious with purpose. These children, who had learned hard lessons about society's unfairness, had chosen to stand against it. The evidence they gathered painted a damning picture: systematic corruption, calculated manipulation, and the targeted exploitation of a child's vulnerability. But more importantly, it showed the power of unexpected allies, how those deemed least important by society could become its strongest defenders. As their case built, these unlikely heroes remained anonymous, working quietly behind the scenes. They understood something the Bradleys never had: that true power often lies not in wealth or status, but in the collective strength of those who choose to stand together for what's right. The first crack in Brandon Bradley's carefully constructed facade peered through his own vanity. A video diary, discovered on a cloud server by Amy's tech-savvy younger brother, revealed the calculated nature of their friendship. Brandon, speaking directly to the camera, had documented his manipulation of Trey with the clinical precision of a social predator. Day 47 of the Smith Project, Brandon's recorded voice echoed through Patterson's basement as the group watched. Subject continues to respond well to social conditioning. Today will begin Phase 2 isolation from previous support systems. The footage showed Brandon methodically planning each interaction, each invitation, each subtle manipulation. More evidence emerged from unexpected sources. The Bradley mansion's staff, tired of years of mistreatment, began coming forward. The family chauffeur provided recordings of conversations between Brandon and his father, discussing their plans for Trey's trust fund while driving to school. A housekeeper had preserved discarded documents outlining the entire scheme. The most damning evidence came from Brandon's own phone. His habit of documenting everything for social media had created an unintentional record of corruption. Photos meant to showcase their friendship instead revealed a pattern of manipulation. Brandon's smug glances at the camera while Trey wasn't looking, calculated poses that positioned him as the puppet master. Text messages between Brandon and his father exposed the depth of their planning. The Smith boy signed the papers today. One message read, "He didn't even read page 3, where we transfer controlling interest. These scholarship kids are so eager to belong they'll sign anything." Each message revealed another layer of calculated cruelty. Financial records, obtained through Mr. Washington's cleaning access to Bradley Development's offices, showed a complex web of transactions designed to drain Trey's trust fund. Every investment opportunity Brandon had suggested led back to Bradley-controlled shell companies. Each business venture had been carefully structured to fail, with assets flowing back to the Bradleys through hidden channels. Security cameras in the Coleman Arms, accessed by the building's sympathetic night guard, captured Brandon's late-night meetings with his father's lawyers. The footage showed them rehearsing scenarios, planning responses to potential legal challenges, even practicing concerned expressions for court appearances. Brandon's school laptop, carelessly left unlocked during a fire drill, yielded a goldmine of information. Drafts of social media posts were pre-written weeks in advance, each designed to build the narrative of Trey's incompetence with money. Spreadsheets tracked their manipulation timeline with corporate efficiency. The school's email server, accessed through Marcus's father's maintenance credentials, revealed correspondence between Brandon and school administrators. Each email showed how the Bradleys had systematically influenced every aspect of Trey's academic life, from class schedules to teacher assignments. Perhaps most shocking were the psychological profiles Brandon had maintained. Detailed notes analyzed Trey's vulnerabilities, tracked his responses to various manipulation techniques, and planned future strategies. The clinical nature of these observations revealed a level of premeditation that stunned even their most cynical allies. Victoria Bradley's Charity Foundation records, obtained through Mrs. Chen's catering access, showed how they had used philanthropic events to launder Trey's assets. Each donation, each charity gala, had been carefully orchestrated to move money through seemingly legitimate channels while maintaining social appearances. Brandon's private journal, discovered by a guilt-ridden former friend, provided the final piece of the puzzle. Written in his own hand, it detailed not just the plan to steal Trey's fortune, but his genuine enjoyment of the process. "It's almost too easy," one entry read, "like training a pet to perform tricks for treats." The evidence painted a picture of manipulation so thorough it bordered on psychological warfare. Brandon had studied Trey's desires, fears and insecurities with the precision of a scientist, using each piece of information to further his family's goals. Every friendship, every social interaction had been carefully choreographed for maximum impact. Social media archives, meticulously compiled by Lisa Martinez, showed how Brandon had orchestrated Trey's public image. Posts were timed for maximum emotional impact, comments were coordinated among their social circle, and even casual photos were staged to support their narrative of Trey's downfall. As the evidence mounted in Patterson's basement, the full scope of Brandon's betrayal became clear. This wasn't just about money, it was about power, control, and the calculated destruction of someone Brandon had viewed not as a friend, but as a social experiment. Each new piece of evidence revealed another layer of premeditated cruelty, another carefully planned step in Trey's systematic destruction. The truth, once exposed, was impossible to ignore. Brandon Bradley hadn't just betrayed a friend, he had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated manipulations their small town had ever seen. And now, thanks to the diligence of those he had dismissed as insignificant, his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. The tide of public opinion began to shift on a rainy Tuesday morning when Amy Chen's father opened his restaurant early to host an emergency community meeting. The small space overflowed with people service workers, small business owners, school staff, and families who had witnessed the Bradleys' manipulation firsthand. Each brought their own piece of the larger truth. Local reporter Michael Hayes, known for his investigative work at the city's independent newspaper, sat in the corner, recording every testimony. The story that emerged wasn't just about a wealthy family's greed, it was about a community's awakening to the systematic destruction of one of their own. Mrs. Henderson, speaking with quiet dignity, recounted conversations she'd overheard while cleaning the Bradley mansion. "They laughed about it," she said, her voice trembling. laughed about how easy it was to manipulate a child who just wanted to belong. Her testimony, captured on video, began circulating on social media, drawing attention from larger news outlets. The school custodians, led by Mr. Washington, organized a press conference in the gymnasium where Trey had once hosted elaborate parties. They presented maintenance logs, security footage, and overheard conversations that painted a damning picture of Brandon's systematic manipulation. The same space that had witnessed Trey's rise and fall now hosted his potential redemption. Social media, once a weapon used against Trey, became a platform for truth. Amy's tech-savvy team created a hashtag that quickly went viral, Justice for Trey. Former classmates began sharing their own stories of the Bradley family's manipulation, creating a digital tsunami that overwhelmed the carefully crafted narrative Brandon had built. Mr. Patterson transformed his store into a command center for the community's response. The same corner where Trey had once counted pennies for lunch became a gathering place for supporters. Local businesses donated supplies, time, and resources to support the growing movement. The solidarity of those the Bradleys had dismissed as insignificant became their most powerful weapon. The media narrative shifted dramatically when Sarah's story finally emerged. Security camera footage of her sleeping in her car, juxtaposed with images of the Bradleys' lavish parties, created a visual story that resonated across social platforms. Her quiet dignity in the face of their cruelty became a symbol of resilience that captured public imagination. National news outlets picked up the story, drawn by the David versus Goliath narrative of a community rising against corporate corruption. Interviews with small business owners revealed patterns of Bradley Development's predatory practices. Each testimony added another crack to the family's carefully maintained facade. The students of Preston Elementary organized their own response. Led by Amy and Marcus, they created a documentary using smartphone footage and social media archives. Their unvarnished perspective on Brandon's manipulation, seen through the eyes of those who had witnessed it firsthand, provided compelling evidence that adults had missed. Local artists contributed their talents, creating murals that told the story of community versus corruption. The same walls that had once advertised Bradley development projects now carried messages of solidarity and resistance. Each artwork became a social media moment, drawing more attention to their cause. Former Bradley employees, emboldened by the growing support, began speaking out. Housekeepers, drivers, and office staff shared their observations of the family's systematic exploitation of Trey's vulnerability. Their testimonies, collected and verified by Hayes, formed the basis of a devastating expose. The turning point came when Brandon's video diary leaked online. His cold calculation, recorded in his own words, shocked even those who had supported the Bradleys. The footage of him planning Trey's downfall, treating it like a social experiment, triggered a wave of public outrage that no amount of PR could contain. Religious leaders, community organizers, and local politicians began speaking out. The same society events where the Bradleys had once held court now became platforms for discussing corporate accountability and the protection of vulnerable youth. Their carefully constructed social world began crumbling under the weight of collective truth. Sarah's co-workers at the diner organized a fundraiser that quickly expanded beyond their expectations. What started as a small effort to help her find stable housing became a symbol of community solidarity. The donations poured in, not just of money, but of time, resources, and support from people touched by her story. The community's response transcended simple revenge. It became a movement about protecting their own, about standing against the exploitation of children, about the power of collective action against corporate greed. Each small act of resistance contributed to a larger wave of change that even the Bradleys' money couldn't stop. Media coverage shifted from portraying Trey as a cautionary tale to revealing him as a victim of sophisticated manipulation. The same platforms that had once mocked his downfall now celebrated the community's efforts to right a wrong. The story became not just about one family's corruption, but about a community's redemption through unified action. The final court hearing took place in a packed courtroom, where the same judge who had frozen Trey's assets now sat facing mountains of evidence collected by unlikely heroes. Sarah, still in her diner uniform after the morning shift, sat beside their young lawyer, while the Bradleys' legal team filled the opposite side with expensive suits and leather briefcases. The prosecution began with Brandon's video diaries, projected onto the courtroom wall. His calculated voice filled the silence. Day 89 convinced Smith to sign control of the trust to shell company Beta. He's so desperate for approval he didn't even read the terms. The footage continued, each entry more damning than the last, documenting a methodical campaign of manipulation. Financial forensics experts, hired pro bono after learning of Sarah's sacrifice, presented their findings. Through complex diagrams, they traced how the Bradleys had systematically drained Trey's trust fund through a network of shell companies. Each transaction, when mapped out, formed a clear pattern of deliberate fraud targeting a miner's assets. Richard Bradley's composed facade cracked when confronted with evidence from his own employees. The family driver's recordings of casual conversations about the Smith conquest played through courthouse speakers. Victoria Bradley's carefully maintained social smile faltered as her charity foundation's role in laundering Trey's assets was exposed. Brandon, facing his former friend in court for the first time since the scheme's exposure, attempted his usual manipulative charm. But his practiced smile disappeared when Amy Chen presented their archived text messages, where he had boasted about training the scholarship puppy. And watching him beg for acceptance, his own words condemned him more effectively than any prosecutor could. The judge's demeanor shifted noticeably as evidence mounted. The same court that had accepted the Bradleys' initial claims about protecting Trey's assets now saw the elaborate nature of their deception. Each document, testimony, and recording revealed another layer of their calculated exploitation of a child's vulnerability. The turning point came when Sarah took the stand. In her waitress uniform, she presented a stark contrast to the Bradleys' polished appearance. Her testimony, delivered with quiet dignity, detailed not just the financial fraud but the systematic destruction of a child's sense of self-worth. The courtroom fell silent as she described sleeping in her car, while the Bradleys hosted parties with money stolen from her son. The defense crumbled as more evidence emerged. School security footage showed Brandon orchestrating Trey's social isolation. Financial records revealed the precise timing of Bradley Development's takeover attempts correlating with Trey's lottery win. Each piece fit together to expose a scheme breathtaking in its calculation and cruelty. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. The Bradleys' assets were frozen pending criminal investigation. Control of Trey's trust fund was returned to court-appointed guardians, with Sarah given oversight. Bradley Development's contracts were suspended, pending review for fraud. The elaborate house of cards they had built began collapsing under the weight of justice. Brandon's final attempt at manipulation backfired spectacularly. His tearful plea about trying to help a friend fell apart when Amy played the last video diary entry, where he gloated about the perfect social experiment. The contrast between his courthouse performance and recorded reality sealed his fate. Criminal charges followed the civil judgment. Richard Bradley's corporate empire faced federal investigation. Victoria's charity foundation lost its tax-exempt status. Brandon's early acceptance to an elite boarding school was rescinded. The carefully constructed world they had built began crumbling, much like they had orchestrated Trey's downfall. Restitution was ordered on a massive scale. Beyond returning Trey's assets, the Bradleys were required to establish a fund for students affected by their predatory development practices. Their mansion would be sold to create affordable housing in the neighborhood they had tried to gentrify. Justice took forms they had never anticipated. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as the verdict was read. Mrs. Henderson hugged Sarah, their tears mixing with relief. Mr. Patterson squeezed Trey's shoulder, while Amy and Marcus exchanged victorious glances. The community that had come together to expose truth now witnessed its triumph over power and privilege. Sarah and Trey left the courthouse to find their neighbors lining the steps. The same community that had witnessed their fall now celebrated their redemption. Mrs. Chen held containers of victory feast, Mr. Washington's daughter had organized a small celebration, and even Trey's former wealthy friends offered awkward but sincere congratulations. As they drove home in Sarah's old car, no longer a shelter but simply transportation, mother and son sat in contemplative silence. The legal victory had restored their financial security, but more importantly, it had validated their truth. Justice had prevailed not through expensive lawyers or powerful connections, but through the collective action of those who chose to stand for what was right. The road to reconciliation began on a quiet Sunday morning, a week after the court victory. Trey found Sarah in their old apartment's kitchen, preparing spaghetti with the same care she had always shown, even during their hardest times. He stood in the doorway, clutching his father's journal, watching her methodically stir the sauce that had once seemed too humble for his expensive tastes. "Mom," he started, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know how to begin." Sarah turned from the stove, her eyes meeting his with the same unconditional love that had never wavered, even when he had rejected it. The distance between them, once measured in social status and designer labels, now felt like an ocean of regret. Tears fell freely as Trey dropped his carefully maintained facade. "I read Dad's journal again," he said, opening to pages marked with post-it notes. He wrote about wanting his son to understand that true wealth isn't in bank accounts. Sarah moved closer, her own eyes glistening as she recognized passages she had memorized during lonely nights in her car. The conversation flowed like a dam breaking. Every moment of shame, every instance of rejection, every cruel word he had spoken, Trey laid them bare. Sarah listened, not interrupting, as her son finally shed the artificial persona he had adopted. Her silence offered the space he needed to find his way back to himself. "When I saw you sleeping in the car," Trey confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "I realized what real sacrifice looks like. You never stopped being my mother, even when I stopped being your son." Sarah's hand found his shoulder, the simple touch bridging years of distance in an instant. They sat at their small kitchen table, the same one Sarah had refused to sell even during their hardest times. Over plates of spaghetti that now tasted like the finest cuisine, they began rebuilding their relationship. Each bite represented a return to authenticity, to the simple truths that money couldn't buy. "I kept every drawing you made in elementary school," Sarah revealed, retrieving a worn folder from a kitchen drawer. "Even during the wealthy days, when you pretended not to know me at school events, I knew my real son was still in there somewhere." The childish artwork, filled with "I love you, Mom" messages, brought fresh tears to both their eyes. Trey shared his own treasured memories, moments Sarah didn't know he remembered. The time she had worked double shifts to buy his school supplies, the night she had helped with homework despite her exhaustion, the way she had maintained his dignity even when they had nothing. Each recollection helped heal the wounds their separation had created. They talked about Eleanor, about her wisdom that now seemed prophetic. "Grandma always said love was worth more than gold," Trey remembered. "I had to lose everything to understand what she meant." Sarah smiled, reaching for the wedding ring that the court had helped recover from the pawn shop. The conversation continued into the evening, neither wanting to break the spell of reconnection. They discussed dreams not of wealth and status, but of real ambitions. Trey spoke of wanting to become a teacher like his father, of using their restored fortune to help other children avoid the traps he had fallen into. Sarah shared her hope of returning to nursing, of healing others as she and Trey had begun to heal their relationship. As night fell, they found themselves looking through old photo albums, tracing their journey together. Pictures of birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes, Christmases with modest but meaningful gifts, simple moments that had once seemed embarrassing, but now represented their unbreakable bond. The final moment of reconciliation came when Trey asked to sleep in his old room. The space, maintained exactly as he had left it, now felt like a sanctuary rather than a reminder of poverty. Sarah tucked him in just as she had done when he was small, and for the first time in months, both mother and son slept peacefully, their relationship restored to its foundation of unconditional love. Morning found them sharing breakfast, making plans not for social climbing or status symbols, but for rebuilding their life together. The wealth restored by the court victory now seemed secondary to the real treasure. They had reclaimed their relationship, strengthened by trial and restored through truth. "I love you," Mom Trey said simply, the words carrying the weight of redemption. Sarah's smile, brighter than any diamond he had once coveted, confirmed that some riches couldn't be measured in dollars. Their reconciliation, built on forgiveness and understanding, marked the beginning of a new chapter 1 where they faced the future together, wealthy in the things that truly mattered. The idea for the Eleanor Smith Foundation was born during a late-night conversation between Trey and Sarah, as they discussed how to honor both Eleanor's memory and the lessons their journey had taught them. The foundation would become their way of transforming pain into purpose, using their restored wealth to prevent other children from falling into the traps of social manipulation and financial exploitation. The foundation's first office occupied the renovated space of Patterson's Market, with Mr. Patterson serving on the board of directors. The simple storefront that had once provided them groceries on credit now became a beacon of hope for struggling families. Each room was named after someone who had helped them during their darkest times: the Henderson Computer Lab, the Washington Study Center, the Chen Community Kitchen. Their mission statement, written in Trey's own hand, hung in the entrance: "Wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire below it." Eleanor's wedding ring sat in a display case, a reminder of the sacrifices that had taught them the true meaning of value. The Foundation's programs reflected their personal experiences. Financial literacy classes taught children about more than just money management. They focused on self-worth, authentic relationships, and the difference between true friendship and social manipulation. Sarah's experiences became case studies in resilience, while Trey's story served as both warning and inspiration. They established scholarships that went beyond tuition assistance. Each grant included mentorship programs pairing recipients with community leaders who understood the challenges of bridging social divides. The selection committee, led by Amy Chen and Marcus Washington, looked for students who showed not just academic promise, but genuine character and community commitment. The Bradley Mansion, acquired through legal settlements, was transformed into a community center. The same rooms that had hosted elaborate parties designed to manipulate a child now offered after-school programs, counseling services, and support groups for families facing gentrification. The irony of this transformation was not lost on anyone. Sarah's role as executive director drew from both her nursing background and her experiences as a struggling single mother. She created programs specifically supporting working parents, offering childcare, job training, and emergency assistance without the shame that often accompanied such services. Her office door remained permanently open, welcoming anyone needing guidance or support. Trey focused on youth outreach, using his unique perspective to connect with children facing similar pressures. He shared his story openly, acknowledging his mistakes while demonstrating the possibility of redemption. His weekly discussion groups helped young people navigate the complexities of social pressure and economic inequality. The Foundation's impact rippled through the community. Former Bradley development properties were converted into affordable housing with built-in support services. Small businesses received microloans and mentorship, creating a network of community support that strengthened local economies while preserving neighborhood character. Education became their cornerstone initiative. The Foundation partnered with Preston Elementary to create programs ensuring no child felt the social isolation Trey had experienced. They established a clothing bank providing school uniforms with dignity, a technology lending library ensuring equal access to educational resources, and counseling services helping students navigate social pressures. Eleanor's teaching philosophy influenced every aspect of their work. Her belief that every child deserved not just education but understanding and support became the foundation's guiding principle. The library, stocked with books she had loved, became a sanctuary where children could dream beyond their current circumstances. The Foundation's annual Eleanor Smith Day celebrated community resilience. Families who had received support returned as volunteers, creating a cycle of giving that strengthened neighborhood bonds. The event, centered around shared meals and stories, embodied Eleanor's belief that true community meant ensuring no one faced struggles alone. Their work attracted national attention, but they maintained their local focus. When offered chances to expand to other cities, they chose instead to create a model others could adapt, sharing their experiences while keeping their direct efforts focused on the community that had supported them. The most meaningful impact came through individual stories: the single mother who completed nursing school while receiving foundation support, the young entrepreneur who opened a successful business with their guidance, the student who found confidence through their mentorship programs. Each success honored Eleanor's memory while validating their mission. As the foundation grew, it remained grounded in personal connection. Sarah and Trey continued living in their old neighborhood, understanding that true impact required remaining part of the community they served. Their home's doors stayed open, offering the same welcome they had received during their own struggles. The Eleanor Smith Foundation became more than a charitable organization. It became a testament to the power of transforming personal pain into community healing. Through its work, they proved that the true measure of wealth lay not in accumulation but in distribution, not in taking but in giving, not in rising above others but in lifting them up alongside you. The decision to renovate rather than relocate was deliberate, a statement about values and roots. Their old apartment building, rescued from Bradley Development's demolition plans, underwent a transformation that honored its history while creating a space for new beginnings. The renovation became a community project, with neighbors contributing skills, time, and memories to the restoration. Sarah and Trey's apartment retained its original layout, though now with updated facilities and repairs long overdue. The kitchen, where they had shared countless spaghetti dinners, received new appliances, but kept the worn spot on the counter where Trey had done his homework. The windows, now properly sealed against winter drafts, still offered the same view of their community. Mrs. Henderson supervised the renovation of the building's common areas, ensuring that improvements didn't erase the character that made it home. But the lobby, where neighbors had once collected donations for Sarah's legal fund, was restored with comfortable seating areas designed to encourage the same community connections that had saved them. Trey's old bedroom became a testament to personal growth. The space now contained both remnants of his past and symbols of his future. His father's journal displayed prominently on a new bookshelf, Eleanor's photos arranged alongside recent family pictures, his childhood drawings framed beside his plans for the Foundation's youth programs. The living room wall that had once shown water damage now featured a mural commissioned from local artists, depicting their community's story of resilience. Children from the building contributed handprints around the border, creating a living testament to the next generation they hoped to support through their work. Their neighbors received renovation assistance as well, fulfilling Trey's childhood wish to help Mrs. Henderson fix her leaky roof. The building became a model for responsible community development, proving that improvement didn't require displacement. Each apartment received necessary updates while preserving the personal touches that made them homes. The courtyard, once neglected, transformed into a community garden where residents shared growing space and stories. Sarah's medical knowledge helped create a section for healing herbs, while Trey worked with neighborhood children to plant flowers in memory of Eleanor. The space became a living classroom for the Foundation's programs about growth and nurturing. They added a small library in the building's basement, filled with books Eleanor had loved and new additions reflecting their community's diverse stories. The space hosted foundation reading programs, homework help sessions, and community meetings, becoming a hub for the kind of education that went beyond textbooks. The renovation included practical improvements, better security systems, updated heating, reliable hot water, but more importantly, it preserved the spirit of community that had sustained them through hard times. The building's improvements became a physical manifestation of their belief that progress shouldn't mean leaving anyone behind. Their apartment's dining room, slightly enlarged but still cozy, became a gathering place for foundation planning meetings and family dinners. The table where they had once counted pennies for rent now hosted discussions about scholarship distributions and community support programs, while still maintaining its primary purpose as the place where mother and son shared daily meals. The view from their windows changed subtly. The Bradley mansion was visible, but no longer dominated the landscape. Instead, they could see the results of their foundation's work: renovated small businesses, maintained parks, and neighbors enjoying their community without fear of displacement. Trey's old study spot by the window remained his favorite place to review foundation applications, now accompanied by the sound of children playing in the courtyard below. The same space where he had once envied the wealthy now gave him perspective on the true meaning of success. They added subtle tributes to those who had helped them throughout their journey. A small plaque near the entrance honored Mr. Patterson's kindness. The hallway featured photographs of community members who had stood by them. Each addition reinforced their commitment to remembering where they came from. The building's renovation included creation of a community room named in Eleanor's honor, where residents could gather for celebrations, meetings, or simply to support each other. The space embodied her belief that true community meant creating places where everyone belonged. Sarah's bedroom received its own updating, though she insisted on keeping certain elements unchanged. The window where she had watched Trey grow up, the corner where she had prayed during their hardest times, the wall where she had marked his height through the years, each preserved as a reminder of their journey. Their renovated home became a symbol of balanced progress, proof that improvement didn't require abandoning history or community. It stood as a testament to their belief that the best changes honor the past while creating space for the future, that true wealth lies not in luxury, but in the strength of shared connections and preserved memories. On the anniversary of their court victory, Sarah and Trey sat down for their traditional spaghetti dinner. The familiar aroma filled their renovated kitchen, but the scene carried deeper meaning now. Eleanor's wedding ring, finally redeemed from the pawn shop, gleamed on Sarah's finger as she stirred the sauce using her mother's old wooden spoon. Just like old times, Trey said, setting their small table with the same care he once reserved for fancy dinner parties. The plates were their original ones, slightly chipped but precious in their history. Each scratch and mark told a story of meals shared through both poverty and wealth, of a bond that had bent but never broken. Sarah moved the pot of pasta to the table, the steam rising like memories between them. The recipe hadn't changed, the same simple ingredients they had relied on during harder times, but the meaning of the meal had evolved. What had once been a symbol of their poverty had become a celebration of their authenticity. As they served each other, their conversation flowed naturally between foundation work and personal dreams. Trey shared stories from his teaching internship at Preston Elementary, where he now worked with students facing the same pressures he had once encountered. Sarah spoke about her nursing recertification classes, her passion for healing finally finding its way back into her life. The ring caught the light as Sarah reached for the Parmesan cheese, the same brand they had always used, though they could now afford imported varieties. Mom, Trey said, noticing the glimmer, "Tell me again about when Grandma gave you that ring." It was a story he had heard many times, but now he understood its true value. Sarah twisted the ring gently, her eyes soft with memory. "She told me that love leaves marks on our hearts the way life leaves marks on gold," she said. "That the scratches and worn spots aren't flaws, they're proof of a life fully lived." The ring's imperfections, like their own history, had become beautiful in their significance. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment. Through the window they could see lights coming on in neighboring apartments, families gathering for their own dinners, creating their own stories. The view reminded them that their journey, though unique, was part of a larger community tapestry. Between bites, they remembered Eleanor's wisdom. How she had taught them that wealth wasn't about what you had, but what you shared. How she had shown them that the richest meals weren't measured by their cost, but by the love that seasoned them. Her presence felt especially strong during these simple family dinners. The spaghetti was the same recipe Sarah had learned as a young mother, watching cooking shows on their old TV while baby Trey slept. Now her son twirled the pasta with the same unconscious gesture he had used as a child, before wealth had taught him to be conscious of every movement. They talked about the future not with the desperate ambition of their past, but with quiet confidence in their purpose. The foundation's work, their community involvement, their personal growth all flowing as naturally as the conversation between mother and son sharing a simple meal. Near the end of dinner, Trey reached across the table and took his mother's hand, feeling the warm metal of Eleanor's ring. "I understand now," he said softly. "What real wealth is." Sarah squeezed his hand, no words necessary between them. The moment was interrupted by a knock at their door, Mrs. Henderson bringing her famous brownies for dessert. They welcomed her to their table without hesitation, the simple dinner expanding naturally to include family of choice as well as blood. This too was wealth, the ability to share without fear of scarcity. As they finished their meal, Sarah and Trey began their ritual of cleaning up together. The tasks they had once divided by necessity now became a chosen celebration of cooperation. They moved around their kitchen with practiced ease, their domesticity a dance of reconciliation and renewed connection. The ring sparkled as Sarah washed dishes, its presence both an anchor to their past and a beacon for their future. Each facet caught light differently, just as their experiences had revealed new aspects of their relationship. What had once been pawned in desperation now symbolized not just survival but triumph. And their evening ended as it had begun, with mother and son sitting together, sharing the comfortable silence of true understanding. The smell of spaghetti lingered in their kitchen, mixing with Mrs. Henderson's brownies, creating an aroma of home that no amount of money could replicate. In this simple scene, a mother, a son, a family recipe, and a redeemed ring lay the real ending to their story, not in grand gestures or material wealth, but in the quiet victory of love restored and wisdom hard won. Their weekly spaghetti dinner had become more than a meal. It was a reminder that the richest celebrations are measured in moments shared rather than dollars spent. Thank you for experiencing this emotional journey with us. What did you feel about Sarah and Trey's story? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button to help spread its message of love, redemption, and the true meaning of wealth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories that explore the depths of human relationships and life's most valuable lessons. Share this video with friends and family who might need a reminder that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love and authentic connections. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that matters. Let us know in the comments what would you do if you were in Trey's position.